morning on January the 3rd. This had been a week ago. We might have actually lost some people to golf in the area, I think. But thanks everyone for coming. As you know, the primary goals of these sessions are, one, to help WSGA officials be good WSGA officials, and we're very fortunate that for a medium-sized association we have such a strong group of strong rules officials. We're very fortunate for that, and thank everyone for that. Secondary goal is to help those who are attending a PGA USGA rules workshop this year, and we are fortunate enough to have one in the Milwaukee area in the latter part of March to help start the preparation process for that. And certainly, we're very happy to have those joining us online, whether in Wisconsin or outside Wisconsin, join in as we all try to become better rules officials. So with this year, with the format, we're going to have 6 sessions. Dan Stolper, our Rules Committee Vice Chairman, who's probably spent more time on the new rules than anyone in the Midwest, he and I will be going over the rules segments. And then this year we're going to do something a little different. At the end of each session, Bill Linneman is going to go over a number of sample questions relating to the rules covered that day. And the goals for those questions will be, one, to emphasize the important themes from those rules. We want to make sure people take away with them, but also to get people used to these questions, which actually the USGA had prepared and generously shared with us, to get people used to seeing questions in the format that they'll see on the PGA USGA rules exam, and to start thinking in those terms. So when Bill goes over those questions, he'll also be sprinkling in some tips on how to take the exam, how to read certain questions, how to emphasize certain words, disregard certain words or certain facts that may not be relevant to that particular question, how to eliminate certain choices, and so forth. So with the rules, at the start of each rule, we'll go through some of the definitions that apply to that particular rule, and we'll go through the rules largely in order. There are a few times that we'll take the rules a little bit out of sequence, but we'll always handle, say, the next 4 or 5 rules consecutively or at once. So this week is simple. We're going to start Rule 1. We're going to go through Rule 4 in order. Next week, we're going to cover Rules 5 through 8, but we're going to go a little bit out of sequence, and that we're actually going to start next week with Rule 8 before we cover 5, 6, and 7. And the reason for that is that Rule 8 is a very big rule, very important rule. We want to cover that while everyone is fresh and before everyone, including Dan, Bill, and me, lose interest, get tired, get cranky, and so forth. So with all that, let's go ahead and jump into Rule 1, which covers the game, player conduct, and the rules. And one other point I'll say at the start, it'll be a little bit different from last year, is that as you may recall, last year's sessions, we used only the rules book. Because with the new rules and new format, interpretations are really just examples of the rules. And we wanted to just keep it simple. And there's so much information now in the rules themselves to just go over those. Whereas this year, occasionally Dan and I may refer to an interpretation, but that will not be done frequently, and it will just be to refer to ones that are particularly useful with that. So as we saw last year, each rule, or Rule 1, covers the game, player conduct, and the broader topic of the rules. Each rule now starts with a purpose statement, which is very helpful, because that helps frame and put in perspective what that rule is trying to accomplish. Because so often it's a lot easier to understand, remember a rule if we know philosophically what that rule is trying to accomplish, that why a rule is the way it is. If we know it's to accomplish a certain goal, then that will help us. So the purpose of Rule 1 is to introduce these key principles. That is, to play the course as you find it, and play the ball as it lies, play by the rules, and play in the spirit of the game. And we'll talk in some detail about what spirit of the game means. And then one of the great things with the new set of rules is it talks about, the approach players are expected to take to with the rules. Items that were hinted at occasionally through the rules, but are now expressed explicitly in the rules, such as, this third bullet point: you are responsible for applying your own penalties if you breach a rule. And why? So that you can't gain. And if you breach a rule, so you can't gain an advantage over your opponent, there has to be a penalty of some sort to level things out, to eliminate any potential advantage you may have gained over another player. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into Rule 1.1. The game of golf contains several key fundamentals. Golf's played in a round of 18 holes, but if a committee wants, it can say a round has fewer holes, such as you can absolutely have a 9-hole round. Or if one hole is under construction, you could have a 17-hole round. That is absolutely fine to do. But one thing to keep in mind with that is that if you have, say, a 36-hole match, say like the final of the U.S. Amateur, that is 2 18-hole rounds. That's not one 36-hole round. So it's played on the course by striking a ball with the club. And I apologize, REC, that I neglected to go over the one definition we're supposed to cover with this rule, and that is the definition of general penalty, which fortunately is a short one. General penalty is a catch-all phrase that, for economy of words, is used throughout the rules to refer to a penalty of loss of hole in match play or a penalty of 2 strokes in stroke play. So sorry about that. Now back to Rule 1.1. Each hole starts with a stroke from the teen area and ends when the ball is holed or when the rules otherwise say the hole is completed. So the hole could otherwise be completed, say if the stroke is being exceeded in match play, if there's been a loss of hole penalty in match play, and other situations that we will cover. Next part covers the 2 key principles alluded to in the purpose statement. That is, for each stroke, the player must play the course as he or she finds it. So an important principle that we'll cover in detail next week under Rule 8. So you're not allowed to adjust the course as you find it. You're not allowed to break off, for example, a tree branch that interferes with your swing. And the player must play the ball as it lies. Certainly there are exceptions to that, such as, if your ball winds up on a cart path, you're allowed to take relief, various things like that. Or if your ball is in a penalty area and you elect to take relief, you may. But in general, the player must play the ball as it lies. And Rule 9 will talk to us about will tell us what to do if the player does not do that, such as if the player's ball is moved, does the player have to replace it? If not, what's the penalty if the player plays the ball from its new position? Rule 1.2, standards of player conduct. Now, this is an interesting section that you may remember, and in general, Dan, Bill, and I are not going to talk about the way the rules used to be. There may be times where we'll say this is a change or this is an addition to the rules, but in general, in part, so we don't get confused with people saying, now, hold on, is that the way the rule is or the way the rule used to be? Try not to do that. But this is an interesting and significant section because what it's really taken is a lot of elements from the former etiquette section of the rules book and actually put that in the rules themselves. So it's really, if anything, elevated the importance, the significance of these items, how players conduct themselves on the golf course, and put that into the rules themselves. And it right away tells the golfers how to play the game, and it sets things in a very high standard. Now, we've all been playing the game and around the game for many, many years, but imagine that a newcomer to the rules, to the game, is deciding, oh, you know what, I'm going to start playing golf. Looks like my fun. My friends play it. I want to learn how to play. And then sitting around on a Wisconsin set, Saturday afternoon in the wintertime, he says, he or she says, I want to see, I guess I should see what the rules are about. And right away, to see this up front sends a very strong message to newcomers to the game about what the game is about and what is expected of them. In fact, it uses that word expected. All players are expected to play in the spirit of the game. Not that they should play or they're encouraged to play, but they are expected to play. Which means acting with integrity, for example, by following the rules, applying penalties, and being honest in all aspects of play. So this is one of the ways that many people think golf is quite refreshing compared to other sports. In other sports, whether it's basketball, football, and Gary Wild can sure tell us, players are kind of encouraged to see what they can get away with, right? In golf, it's the opposite. That players are expected to call penalties on themselves. A very different mindset, very different approach, and I think that has a lot to do with the appeal of the game. That players aren't trying to cheat, aren't trying to see if they can do something when the ref's not looking. Because players are expected to penalties to themselves and so forth. Second point, players are expected to show consideration to others. For example, by playing with a prompt pace of play, looking out for the safety of others. For example, while taking practice swings, make sure you don't bonk someone's in the head, and not distracting play of another player. Players are expected to take care of the course, replace divots, rake bunkers, repair ball marks, and not cause any unnecessary damage to the course. We all cringe, for example, when we see players with practice swings take divots. That's not necessary. Now, there's no penalty under the rules if a player does not act in this way in accordance with those 3 bullet points, except that the committee may disqualify a player for acting contrary to the spirit of the game if the committee finds the player has committed serious misconduct. And we do have interpretation 1.2a/1 that actually goes into some detail with what is considered serious misconduct. We won't go through that entire interpretation. The keys are really in the first 2 paragraphs, where the phrase serious misconduct is intended to cover misconduct that's so far removed from the expected norm that the most severe sanction of removing a player from the competition is justified. This includes dishonesty, deliberately interfering with another player's rights, or endangering the safety of others. And it's ultimately up to each committee to determine if the misconduct, if the player is guilty of serious misconduct. And often the committee, will take the view that it'll warn the player, say, hey, look, if you do this again, you're disqualified. No penalty for this first time, but if you do it again, you're disqualified. But sometimes, there are going to be acts where, just the player should be disqualified right away, such as if the player throws a club at another player. We don't want that player on the golf course. But again, that's in a number of examples and interpretation 1.2a/1. Penalties other than disqualification, so for example, the general penalty of loss of hole or 2 strokes, may be imposed for player misconduct only if those penalties are adopted as part of a code of conduct, which leads us into the next section, Rule 1.2b. The committee may, it's not a requirement, but may set its own standards of player conduct in a code of conduct adopted as a local rule. So first time that the committee's been authorized to do this. And this code may include penalties for breach of its standards. Could be a 1-stroke penalty, could be a general penalty. And the committee may also disqualify a player for serious misconduct and failing to meet the code's standards. So several points here. If a committee wants, for example, to penalize a player for breach of a dress code, the committee has that right, but needs to spell that out beforehand in the code of conduct. It needs to say what's prohibited and what the penalty is. Some high school, for example, might have a no tobacco policy. It might say if a player breaches the tobacco policy might be part of the code of conduct. And if a player smokes during the round, players subject to the general penalty. So when you combine these two sections, if there are two different ways to look at it. If the committee adopts a code of conduct, then the penalty can be whatever the committee specifies in that code of conduct. If the committee has not adopted a code of conduct, then the penalty is all or nothing. It's either no penalty for whatever the player does, or it's disqualification if the committee thinks it's serious misconduct. And then we see our first reference to the committee procedures section, which is in the official guide. And that is a useful section that I hope everyone will go through, especially those involved with conducting competitions. Is there in section 5H, there's a part about considerations for adopting a code of conduct, items that perhaps are appropriate or not appropriate to include with that. All right, rule 1.3, playing by the rules. First, what does the term rules mean? Well, it includes rules 1 through 24 and the definitions and the local rules. Players are also responsible for complying with the terms of competition. 1.3b, applying the rules. Players are responsible for applying the rules to themselves. Again, one-way golf is very different from other sports. Players are expected to recognize when they've breached a rule and to be honest in applying their own penalties. Now, if a player knows that he or she's breached a rule that involves a penalty, and that player deliberately fails to apply the penalty, the player is disqualified. And note that that applies both to match play and stroke play. That if a player knows he or she's breached a rule, the player must apply that penalty. So the good thing with that is that makes it in the player's own interest to be honest, and to report and to apply any penalties incurred. Because if the player doesn't, then the player has the threat of disqualification hanging over his or her head. Now, if two or more players deliberately agree to ignore a rule or penalty that they know applies, and any of those players have started the round, they are disqualified even if they have not yet acted on the agreement. So there's a lot in this, and let's go through a few examples. First, this rule applies when two players know what the rule is, they know what the right procedure is, they know what the right penalty is, but they deliberately agree not to apply the rules. So let's go through two examples. Let's say Phil and I are playing together and we're playing a match. In the fourth fairway, I turned to Phil and said, "Oh my gosh, Phil, I have just realized I've started around 15 clubs. What do I do?" Phil says, I have no idea, but as long as you haven't used more than 14 clubs through the first 3.5 holes, seems like there's no penalty, and maybe you just need to take one of those clubs out of play for the rest of the round. I said, okay, that seems reasonable. Let's go with that. So if Phil and I agree to do that because we don't know what the right rule is, then we haven't agreed not to apply the rules. So there's no penalty to that, and we're bound by whatever we agree. But on the other hand, on the fourth fairway, if I say, Phil, oh my gosh, I have 15 clubs, he says, yeah, but John, you lost the first 3 holes. You just hit your tee shot here on 4 out of bounds. The penalty is normally would normally be a deduction of 2 holes, but you're playing so poorly, let's not worry about that. And I say, Phil, thanks, you're great, and we play on. Then in that case, we're going to be disqualified, because there we know what the right procedure is, we know what the right penalty is, and we are deliberately not applying that. Now, where it talks about if the players have started the round, what happens? That covers the rare case where, let's say, Dan and I are playing a course that has out of bounds left and right on every hole. And before we play, I say, Dan, I don't know about you, but I'm hitting the ball all over the place. This could be a bad round. And Dan says, yeah, John, you know what? I'm not hitting that straight either. why don't we just treat the out of bounds like a red penalty area? Even though we're not allowed to do that, even though the penalty for going out of bounds is stroke and distance, let's just save ourselves some heartache, help our scores, and drop the ball and agree that if one of us hits it out of bounds, we just drop where it went out with one stroke penalty. It's like, okay, Dan, that's very reasonable. That'll make the round more enjoyable. Thank you. But then, Dan has the honor on the first team right before he tees off. He says, or let's say he goes ahead, tees off, and hits it right down the fairway. Then at that point, what happens? We're disqualified. But what happens if before Dan tees off on the first hole, he says, John, you know what? I don't feel right about that. I don't think that's the right way to do it. Let's just play by the rules and treat out of bounds with stroke and distance. I say, okay, fine, Dan, we'll do it your way. Then in that case, we've negated that agreement before we've teed off, so no penalty. So pretty rare situation, but could come up. And one important point and very useful point has been added to the rules is this applies even if the players haven't acted on this agreement. So let's say Dan and I tee off and we agree to treat all out of bounds as a red penalty area. But we both have great driving days, neither one of us hits it out of bounds. We're both going to be disqualified. Because the argument could be made that knowing that the penalty for hitting out of bounds isn't as severe made us swing more freely with less fear, etc. All right, when it's necessary to decide questions of fact, the player is responsible for considering not only his or her own knowledge, but also any information that is reasonably available. So for example, it could be if a player hits the ball toward a penalty area and determining whether it's known or virtually certain the ball's in the penalty area, or if the ball is in the penalty area, where the ball last crossed the edge of the penalty area. The player would consider what he or she knows, and let's say, for example, there's some spectators in the area that are right there. This means that the player is obligated to inquire to see what they know. If they may have seen something that the player did not see. A player may ask for help with the rules from a referee or from the committee, but if that help's not available in a reasonable time, for example, you have a qualifying round with a total of 3 officials on the golf course, inevitably, you might, may not be an official right when you need one. The player must play on and raise the issue with the referee or the committee when possible. So when you come across a committee member, ask him what your question was from two holes ago. All right, next section of the rule regarding a principle that had previously been in the decisions, but now has been formalized in the rules themselves regarding a player's reasonable judgment. First, acknowledgement that many rules require a player to determine a spot, a point, a line, an area, or other location under the rules, such as, estimating. And this is one of the nice things with these new rules. New rules actually contain examples to help us understand. Estimating where a ball last crossed the edge of a penalty area, estimating or measuring when dropping or placing a ball and taking relief, and when replacing a ball on the original spot, whether that spot was known or whether it was estimated. So now these determinations need to be made promptly. Players shouldn't agonize over it for 15 minutes because that's not going to help the pace of play. It also needs to be done with care because we want players to play from the right place. But the rules acknowledge that these determinations can't be precise. And that an interesting exercise can be to have 10 people, put them all on camera, have them lift a ball with a dime behind it, then have them all replace the ball and see in how many different spots people trying to put it back in the right place don't actually put it back in truly the correct place. We know that that's almost impossible to do, but as long as the player uses, as we'll see in the next section, uses reasonable judgment, that's going to be okay, and the player will fulfill his or her responsibilities under the rules. So long as the player does what can be reasonably expected under the circumstances to make the accurate determination, the player's reasonable judgment
That's a key phrase to underline. Reasonable judgment will be accepted even if after the stroke the determination is shown to be wrong by video evidence or some other information. So in other words, if the player does everything the player could reasonably do to determine where the ball last crossed the edge of the penalty area, including talking with anyone who may have seen it in the area, the player drops and plays accordingly, and then later, television replay shows that, well, actually the ball crossed 5 feet from that spot. We're going to say the player's okay, no penalty. The player used reasonable judgment, and that's fine. Now, where this is different, though, is if the player becomes aware of a wrong determination before the stroke is made. So even if the player had used reasonable judgment in determining where that ball had last crossed the edge of the penalty area, even if the player drops the ball, before the player plays, let's say, somehow from television, someone gets a hold of someone near the player and says, oh, hold on, television actually shows that the ball crossed 5 or 10 feet there. Then there's no penalty for the player for having dropped the ball in that spot, but the player is now aware that he or she's dropped in a wrong place, would simply lift the ball and then drop it in the right place corresponding to where the more definitive evidence, the video evidence, indicates the ball crossed the edge of the penalty area. So a different treatment with, say, the video evidence example based on whether that was discovered before or after the player played the ball. All right, Rule 1.3c, penalties. First, how can a player incur a penalty? A penalty applies when a breach of rule results from the player's own actions or the actions of the player's caddy. A penalty also applies if another person takes an action that would breach the rules if taken by the player or caddy and, underline and, that player does so at the player's request or while acting with the player's authority. So, for example, my ball's behind a tree. There's a tree branch that's on my line of play, and I know enough about the rules to know that I can't break that tree branch. And this is, as they say, where a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But I think, well, I can't do it, but presumably Bill, the spectator, can do that. So I say, Bill, would you please go up and break that tree branch off? Bill says, sure, John, a little strange, but okay. And Bill does so. So, we're not going to penalize Bill, the spectator, but what about me? And the answer is yes, I would be penalized. I'd be treated as if I had done that myself. Second situation where the player is penalized is if the player sees another person about to take an action concerning the player's ball or equipment that he or she knows would be a breach of the rules if the player took it himself or herself, and the player does not take reasonable steps to object or stop it from happening. So let's say, take that example and twist the facts a little bit. I get up to my ball behind a tree. I see there's a tree branch on my line of play, and I see Bill walking over there very slowly, putting his hands on the tree branch, and he braces himself like he's about to break the tree branch. And I know that I'm not allowed to break that tree branch, but if I don't stop Bill from doing that, then I'm going to be penalized, just as in the first example. Next section, a level of penalties. A nice philosophical statement to help put things in perspective. Penalties are meant to cancel out any potential advantage to the player, and there are 3 main penalty levels. One penalty stroke, and this applies both in match play and stroke play, and applies to situations where either the potential advantage from a breach is minor or the player is taking penalty relief, such as from a penalty area. The general penalty of loss of hole in match play or 2 strokes in stroke play. This applies for breach of most rules where the potential advantage is more significant than where 1 penalty stroke would apply. In part because you'd hate to have a situation, say in match play, where a player might say, gosh, if this is just a one-stroke penalty or a two-stroke penalty, I'll gladly accept that penalty because I think I'm going to get such a break from doing it. But if the penalty is loss of hole, then obviously the player's not going to want to do that. And you don't want to have a situation where players intentionally breach rules. Disqualification is the third level of penalties, and that applies in both match play and stroke play for certain actions or for rules breaches involving serious misconduct, as we saw before, or where the potential advantage is too significant for the player's score to be considered valid. So there can be some breaches where it's just not possible to quantify any potential advantage the player may have gained. And a great example of that is equipment. The use of non-conforming equipment. For example, if a player has a magic golf ball that goes string straight every time, goes 300 yards with the driver every time, how can you say that that's a two-stroke advantage, four-stroke advantage, six-stroke advantage, or what? You really can't. So that's why you just say, sorry, if you make a stroke with non-conforming equipment, say non-conforming ball, that would be a disqualification.
Well, I can't use that ball.
Bob, I'm sorry, if you got that magic dozen for Christmas. Third section, this is something that especially committees should keep in mind. Penalties need to be applied only as provided in the rules. Neither a player nor the committee has the authority to apply penalties in a different way. So, for example, if a player in a WSGA event this year improves line of play by breaking a tree branch, and Bill says, you know what, two strokes seems a little much in those circumstances, we'll just say it's one stroke. No, can't do that. It's either no breach or it's the general penalty in stroke play, two strokes. Now, a wrong application of a penalty or a failure to apply a penalty may stand only if it's too late to correct it. And in Rule 20, we'll go over that in detail because one of the important things and inevitable facts of officiating is dealing with wrong rulings. As the saying goes, there are only two types of rules officials: those who've made wrong rulings and those who will make wrong rulings. And we'll talk about how in Rule 20 to deal with that. No, and it's an absolute fact as well. In fact, I remember the very first time I officiate on the golf course after having spent a year or so answering thousands and thousands of phone calls and back then letters with rules questions at the WSGA. The US Junior was being played nearby, and it rained a lot overnight. Won't go into the details, but it involved relief from temporary water. The very first hole, I gave a wrong ruling in terms of how the player would go about taking relief from temporary water. And there's slight consolation in the fact that the rule was later changed to correspond with the ruling I gave. But the bottom line is it was still a wrong ruling. So no worries about that. That happens, and the rules anticipate that, and they fortunately give us guidance on how to deal with that. Next section, applying penalties to multiple breaches of the rules. And this can sound somewhat complicated, and in all candor there can be some situations where it does get somewhat complicated, but we're not going to dwell on this too much because fortunately in WSGA events, these situations come up extremely rarely. In fact, Bill, would you say in 2019, can you think of an instance this came up, or?
Probably.
Okay.
Multiple causes consternation, but really.
Yeah, and Bill makes a good point. There are a handful of interpretations under this rule, and we won't really go through those, but just know that they're there. But a lot of good information is now in the rule itself to help committees determine what happens when the player has breached the same rule several times or has breached different rules before a single stroke? Is the player penalized once? Is the player penalized multiple times? And certainly, this has more meaning, more significance in stroke play, because often in match play, one of those rules would be a loss of hold penalty, and that ends the conversation, which is one reason we all like match play so much. If a player breaches multiple rules or the same rule multiple times before an intervening event happens, and examples of intervening event would be making a stroke or becoming aware of the breach, the penalty that applies depends as to what happened. First item, when the breaches resulted from unrelated acts, the player gets a separate penalty for each breach. So to give a simple example, let's say I'm back behind that tree and I turn to Phil, who's, let's say, another player, and ask him how he would play the shot. And then I go up and break the tree branch, and thereby improving my line of play. So I've breached two rules, the advice rule and the conditions affecting the stroke rule. So in that case, and those were unrelated acts there, in stroke play, in match play, we know it's just going to be simple loss of hold, but in stroke play, I'm going to get two stroke penalties. Next situation, when breaches resulted from a single act or from related acts, then the player would get only one penalty. But if the act or acts breached multiple rules involving different penalties, the higher level penalty applies. Now, that second half of that sentence, starting with but, that treats a very specific and very rare situation where what the player's done is he's breached one rule that involves one stroke and another rule that involves, say, a two-stroke penalty. And that's to say, when this rule says, okay, the player just gets one penalty, but which penalty is it? It would, in that case, be the two-stroke penalty. Then the first part is really the more common one. Player gets one penalty. So we have some examples. Multiple procedural breaches. If the single act or related acts breach more than one of the procedural requirements for marking, lifting, cleaning, dropping, replacing, or placing a ball, when the penalty is one stroke, such as both lifting a ball without marking its spot and cleaning the lifted ball when not allowed, let's say because the ball was in the fairway and it interfered with another player's play, then the player gets one penalty stroke in total. The rule says, well, if you don't mark the spot of the ball before you lift it, it's a penalty stroke. If you clean the ball when you're not allowed to lift it, it's one penalty stroke. But in that case, it's considered the player will just get a total of one penalty stroke, and that would be both match play and stroke play. Second one, player incorrectly substitutes a ball and plays that ball from the wrong place. Well, we know that in match play, it's going to be a simple loss of hold penalty. In stroke play, it's a question of whether the player gets two penalty strokes and four penalty strokes. In this case, the player gets a total of two penalty strokes. Third example, combined procedural and substitution wrong place breaches. So if you combine those first two items. If a single act or related acts breach one or more procedural requirements when the penalty is one stroke, and also breach one or both of the rules against playing an incorrectly substituted ball and playing from the wrong place, the player gets a total of two penalty strokes. So let's say in that case where the player lifts the ball from the fairway, is asked to lift the ball because it interferes with someone's play from the fairway, player doesn't mark the spot of the ball, cleans the ball when not allowed to, and the player does not correctly replace the ball, i.e. the player plays from the wrong place. In stroke play, the player will get a total penalty of two strokes. The final paragraph here is important to note, especially with exam questions. But any penalty strokes a player gets for taking penalty relief are always applied in addition to other penalties. So, for example, let's say a player is taking relief from a red penalty area, and the player is using the lateral relief option of dropping within 2 club lengths of where the ball last crossed the edge of the penalty area. But instead, the player drops and plays 3 club links from the edge. Match play, the player's played from the wrong place, loses the hole. In stroke play, how many total penalty strokes does the player incur? Well, player gets total of 3. One way to look at it is the player gets 1 penalty stroke simply for taking relief. That no matter what the player does, that penalty stroke is going to stay with the player, because that's part of the procedure. And then the player is played from the wrong place, so the player is going to get 2 penalty strokes for playing from the wrong place. In this case, the player does combine those 2, so for a total penalty of 3 strokes. So on the exam, when the question asks how many total penalty strokes did the player incur, remember to include that penalty stroke for taking relief in the first place. All right, so that's Rule 1. Any questions on Rule 1?
That last paragraph would also include
Penalty relief under Rule 16. Yeah, anytime that you're taking penalty relief, that yes. All right, now we'll go on to Rule 2, which talks about the course. And this time, I'll remember to start with the definitions. First definition on page 201 of the rules book, areas of the course. This is an umbrella definition that covers the 5 areas that we'll go over in more detail. Those are the general area, the teen area, all penalty areas, all bunkers, and the putting green. Now notice general area, penalty areas, and bunkers always apply, but teen area and putting green will change from hole to hole, because those are relevant only to, or consider the teen area and putting green of the hole being played. All right, next definition, course. On page 203. We are, for some reason, I was not doing it in alphabetical order, but I'm not quite sure why that is. But actually, Dan, I want to say I copied this down from your email list. You may well have listed these in this order. I'll have to show you my email afterwards. Course. Entire area of play within the edge of any boundaries set by the committee. So all areas inside the boundary edge are in bounds and are part of the course. All areas outside the boundary edge are not part of the course. Boundary edge extends up and down, and the course is made up of the 5 defined areas. Now, one point to keep in mind is course is dependent on the committee. It's up to the committee to define what the course is. That nothing is automatically not part of the course. That property ownership, for example, does not affect what is and is not the course. That there have been times I've seen a course through a housing development where the committee has said there is no out of bounds. If you hit it into someone's yard, go play it. That can, so what happens if you hit it up against the plate that someone's house? Well, that house would be an immovable obstruction. You take relief from it. What happens if the house is between your ball and the hole but doesn't interfere with it? Then you have to question how confident you're feeling about your game, whether you're going to try to hit the ball over the house. But that's entirely up to each committee. General area. Is a new term for this year, or for last year. It's the area of the course that covers all the course except for the other 4 defined areas. And those are the teen area of the hole being played, all penalty areas, all bunkers, and the putting green of the hole being played. So the general area includes all teen locations on the course other than the teen area and all wrong greens. So, question that, does come up occasionally. Let's say a player's playing the 4th hole. It's a wild tee shot and the player's playing from the blue tee markers. It's a wild tee shot onto the teen area for the 7th hole for the blue tee markers. What part of the course does the player lie on? The general area. And a related question, we know that there's a rule that says you're not allowed to play from a wrong putting green. But what about a so-called wrong teeing area in this case? Is the player allowed, or is the player actually required to play from that 7th teeing area? And the answer is yes, the player is required to play from there. No special relief. And the tee markers will be movable for the 7th hole. Exactly. All right, next one, boundary object. Artificial objects defining or showing out of bounds, such as walls, fences, stakes, and railings, from which free relief is not allowed. So this is helpful. And now, right in the definition itself, we'll see in the rules, we explicitly say free relief is not allowed. And this includes any base and post of a boundary fence, but does not include angled supports or guy wires, or any steps, bridge, or similar construction used for getting over the wall or fence. We go on to say that boundary objects are treated as immovable, even if they are movable or any part of them is movable. They're not obstructions and they're not integral objects. So what does this mean? First, players not allowed to take free relief from a boundary object. And second is that a player is not allowed to dismantle or remove a boundary object if that would improve the conditions affecting the stroke. For example, if a white boundary stake is on the player's line of play, the player may not go up and remove that boundary stake. Is it a requirement for the committee to define each and every boundary object on the course? And the answer will depend as to what's being used. And the committee does need to say what defines out of bounds. But we'll say that when we talk about later about out of bounds and what defines the out of bounds line, some things are in definition, some are not. So for example, a good example is a wall. If a wall is used to define out of bounds, the rules themselves don't say which face of the wall defines out of bounds. So in that case, the committee would need to say whether it's the interior face or the exterior face that defines the boundary. And last definition that we touched on at the end here is integral object. An integral object is an artificial object defined by the committee as part of the challenge of playing the course and from which free relief is not allowed. Integral objects are treated as immovable, meaning the player is not allowed to move it. But if part of an integral object, such as a gate, meets the definition of a movable obstruction, then that part is treated as a movable obstruction. Artificial objects defined as integral objects are not obstructions and are not boundary objects. But so the key, no free relief and no moving it, unless it's something like a gate or window or something that's designed to be moved. Good examples of integral objects are the road behind 17th Green on the old course at St. Andrews. You hit your ball over that by local rule, that has been declared by the committee as an integral object, so no free relief from it. Ball winds up on the road. You have to play it off the road or take unplayable ball relief. The more common example we come across is artificial walls inside penalty areas, where often the committee will say if there are railroad ties or a stone wall, say around a pond, will often say by local rule that those are integral objects. And the reason for that is to how a ball that's outside that penalty area is treated. Is we just know that under the rules, with no local rules in effect, if the player's ball is in the penalty area on top of that retaining wall, the player does not get relief. Because if your ball is in a penalty area, you don't get free relief from an immovable obstruction. However, if that player's ball were just outside the, say, the red line, and the player would be standing on that wall inside the penalty area to play the ball, then without any local rules in effect, the player would be entitled to relief. And sometimes a committee will say, you know, that's a little too fortunate. As the player hit her ball into this awkward spot so close to the penalty area, and the player should have to deal with an awkward stance from there. But that's something for each committee to decide. All right, now for the rule itself. Purpose of the rule is to introduce the basic things every player should know about the course, the 5 defined areas of the course. There's several types of defined objects and conditions that can interfere with play. And then this is useful. It goes on to say it's important to know the area of the course where the ball lies and the status of any object or condition, because they often affect the player's options for playing the ball or for taking relief. You know, such as the example we just saw with the penalty area. If a player's ball is in a penalty area, player is not entitled to free relief from an abnormal course condition, even if that abnormal course condition is outside the penalty area. But if the player's ball is in the general area, the player is entitled to free relief from, say, an immovable obstruction. But if the player's ball is on the putting green and there's a sprinkler head there, an immovable obstruction, the relief procedure is going to be different than it would be in the general area. So that's why it's important to know in what part of the course the player's ball lies. Rule 2.1, course boundaries and out of bounds. Golf's played on a course where boundaries are set by the committee. Areas not on the course are out of bounds. 2.2, the 5 areas of the course. So we've talked about these in definitions. Now we'll go over them in some more detail. The general area covers entire course except the 4 specific areas of the course. And why is it called the general area? We know that's a new term for 2019 because it covers the great majority of the course, and it's where a player's ball most often be played until the ball reaches the putting green. It includes every type of ground and growing or attached object found in that area, such as fairway, rough, trees, bushes. And here, you know, when we turn the page on Rule 24 of the rules book, we see the first of several nice additions to the rules, and that is diagrams that help us understand the rules better. And this diagram here shows us clearly the 5 areas of the course. Rule 2.2b talks about the 4 specific areas, i.e. the ones other than the general area. Those are the teen area the player must use in starting the hole he or she's playing, all penalty areas, all bunkers, and the putting green of the hole the player is playing. Now, determining the area of the course where the ball lies. We just talked about why that is important, as it affects the rules that apply. The ball is always treated as lying in only one area of the course. So now we'll talk about what happens if the ball actually touches 2 areas of the course. If a part of the ball is in both the general area and one of the 4 specific areas, then the ball is treated as lying in that specific area. So if it touches, for most common example is the fringe of the putting green and the putting green itself, then the ball is considered to be on the putting green, which is good news for the player because then the player is allowed to lift and clean the ball. Second point is if part of the ball is in 2 of the specific areas of the course. It's treated as lying in the specific areas that comes first in this order. That is penalty area, bunker, putting green. So this could probably the most common example of this, which isn't that common, but let's say you have a so-called beach bunker, you know, a bunker that just flows into a pond, and the committee, you know, still has to define the edge of the penalty area. And let's say it's painted a line, which, you know, can be challenging to do in the sand, but it's painted a line. Part of the ball touches the line, the red or yellow line of the penalty area, and part of the ball touches the bunker. So in that case, where would that ball be considered to lie? In the penalty area. All right, next rule, 2.3, objects or conditions that can interfere with play. Certain rules may give free relief from interference by certain objects, such as loose impediments, movable obstructions, abnormal course conditions, and we'll see later what's included by that. But there's no free relief from boundary objects or integral objects that interfere with play. So this is a nice place, nice way to have in one spot, a little bit of a summary as to what a player's entitled to free relief from and what a player's not entitled to free relief from. A no play zone, a new term for 2019, is a defined part of either an abnormal course condition, such as ground under repair, or a penalty area where play is not allowed. So as the name suggests, a player must take relief when his or her ball is in a no play zone, because the player is not allowed to play from there, or if the ball is outside the no play zone, but part of the no play zone interferes with the player's area of intended stance or area of intended swing, the player must still take relief. And in Rule 16, we'll go over how the player will go about taking relief. All right, any questions on Rule 2? All right, now on to Rule 3. And we'll start with the definitions, which, Dan, I might have an alphabetical order this time. Start with marker. A marker exists only in stroke play, and the marker is the person who's responsible for entering a player's score on the player's scorecard and for certifying the scorecard. The marker may be another player, but not a partner, as that would be a conflict of interest. The committee may identify who will be the player's marker or tell the players how they may choose a marker. So more often than not, on the first tee, the starter will hand the scorecards to the committee and say, Phil, you keep Bill's score. Bill, you keep Dan's score. Dan, you keep John's score. Something like that. Next definition is match play. Right under it, a form of play where a player or side plays directly against an opponent or opposing side in a head-to-head match of one or more rounds. As you could have as is the case with most of the finals of the USGA championships, you could have a 36-hole match. The player or side wins a hole by completing the hole in fewer strokes, and the match is won when a player or side leads the opponent by more holes than remain to be played. There's several different forms of match play: singles match play, 3-ball, foursomes, and 4-ball. And we'll go through all those in due course. While we're on match play, we'll look at the definition of opponent. Opponent is simply the person a player competes against in a match. So this is unique to match play. Then we'll have something that's unique to stroke play, which is scorecard, which is the document where a player's score for each hole is entered in stroke play. Scorecard may be in paper or electronic form provided by the committee that allows the score to be entered for each hole, the handicap to be entered if it's a handicap competition, and for both the marker and player to certify the scores. And if it's a handicap competition, for the player to certify his or her handicap, whether that's by physical signature or a method of electronic certification approved by the committee. So in WSGA events, that will mean a signature. We have not reached the point of electronic scorecards, and I'm not sure we will, but that's certainly possible. A scorecard is not required in match play, but may be used by the players to help keep the match score. So a scorecard in match play can be useful, but does not carry any official significance. Last definition of stroke play, which is a form of play where a player or side competes against all other players or sides in the competition. The regular form of stroke play, players score for a round as total number of strokes, including any penalty strokes to hole out for each hole. And the winner is the player who completes all the rounds in the fewest number of strokes. Now, there are some different forms of stroke play where the scoring is kept differently, where it's not necessarily just the number of strokes taken, such as Stableford, which is points, maximum score, which caps the maximum score for a particular hole for a player, and then par bogey competition, where the scoring is actually done as in match play. And stroke play can be either an individual competition or one involving partners in foursome or 4-ball play. All right, now for the rule itself. Rule 3.1A, form of play. I'm sorry, let's start with the purpose. Rule 3 covers the 3 central elements: playing either match play or stroke play, playing either as an individual or as a partner, and then scoring either on a gross basis or on a net basis with handicap strokes. Rule 3.1A talks about form of play, match play, or stroke play. And first, and this is interesting, it should tell us on that very first line, these are very different forms of play. The fact that the rules makers, added the word very should tell us something, and that's why the rules are some of the rules regarding 2 forms of play are going to be quite different. And why are these very different? Because of their very nature. In match play, a player and opponent compete against each other based on holes won, lost, or tied. So if Gary and John are playing against each other, Gary and John are only the ones directly involved with that match. That if Bill and I are playing a separate match, we have no direct relationship with anything going on in the match between Gary and John. And that's why some of the situations, some of the procedures, some of the penalties in match play can be different than they are in stroke play. Because in stroke play, all players compete with one another based on total score. So if Gary, John, Bill, and I are all playing a stroke play event, but we're playing in 2 different groups, then I do care what Gary is doing over there on the 3rd hole. If he looks like he's up to something shady, I'm going to be concerned. And I want to make sure that Gary's score at the end of the round is accurate, because I'm competing against him, and I want to make sure I beat him. Most of the rules apply in both forms of play, but certain rules apply in only one or the other. Other forms of play, talk about Stableford, maximum score, and par bogey. We'll see. We'll go into more detail later in our last session. All right, then rule 3.1b, how players compete, playing as individuals or as partners. And we have an important part here that helps put the rest of the rules in perspective. So we know that golf's played either on an individual basis or with having a partner. But then it goes, this is an important part. Although rules 1 through 20 focus on individual play, and that's a useful point to keep in mind, that so often in rules 1 through 20, you won't see references to the player's partner, for example. But occasionally, if it is a 4-ball event, you do need to stop and think and say, okay, well, hold on. If this is a 4-ball event, how would this rule apply? And the rules are written that way, I think for simplicity, just to eliminate confusion by talking about the player's partner for that. In competitions involving partners, we know rules 1 through 20 still apply, but there are going to be some modifications in rules 22 and 23. Then rule 24 about team competitions, such as high school events, you'll see some modifications. Rule 3.1c, how players score. Oh, yeah.
So, if that's the case, and you were to have questions come up, you start with the rule that falls in 1 through 20, and then flip to how it's modified and try to apply it.
Exactly, okay. Exactly. And later, I think Dan is teaching Rule 23, where there's a specific rule and provision that'll tell us how to apply. That if your partner does something, when you're penalized, when you're not penalized, and it can be tricky. So we all have to stop, pause, and think about it, about the right way to apply. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a good example, and one that I just turned to, is on page 78 under Rule 9.2b, as Bill said. Look under in blue where it refers to Rule 22.2 and Rule 23.5. So it's just a reminder in the foursome or 4-ball format to look to those rules. Which and Bill makes a good point that that's a nice reminder to us to be aware of the form of play. All right, Rule 3.1C, how players score. Well, there are two ways to do it: gross scores or net scores. And WSGA events, we have both forms of competition. The player's gross score is simply the total number of strokes taken, including any penalty strokes, without the handicap being applied. And in a handicap competition, the net score is the adjusted score, the gross score that's been adjusted based on the player's handicap. And one point to keep in mind, and one point where just as last year we were, grateful for the fact that our tournament season doesn't start until May. Similar to this year, that remember that where with the World Handicap System took effect January 1st, and I think we're in a kind of a 5-day pause with that, and so we all need to be mindful of the new handicap system regulations, policies. But one very important point is any questions regarding that should are best directed to John Warren on the WSGA staff and not to Dan, Bill, or me. And sorry about that, John, but you're the expert. And we most definitely are not. So, and again, this is one of the appealing things of golf is the handicap system and how you have players of different abilities compete against each other. Something that's hard to do in other sports. All right. Since historically match play came before stroke play, we will talk about some rules that are unique to match play first. And I'll cover Rule 3.2, and we'll take a break, and Dan will cover, start with Rule 3.3, and then take us through Rule 4. So the purpose of Rule 3.2. Match play has specific rules, particularly about concessions and giving information about the number of strokes, because the player and opponent compete solely against each other, can see each other's play, and can protect their own interests. So in other words, those 3 bullet points do not apply at all to stroke play, but they do apply to match play, and that influences why some of these following rules are the way they are and why these rules would not work well in stroke play. First, a result of hole and match. Player wins a hole when the player completes the hole in the fewer strokes than the opponent. So if Bill makes a 3, I make a 4, Bill wins the hole. The opponent concedes the hole. So Bill's line 3 near the hole, I'm line 5 in a bunker, I concede the hole to Bill, Bill wins. Or the opponent gets the general penalty. So if Bill's lying on the green, I'm playing from a greenside bunker, and I touch the sand with my backswing. I incur the general penalty, I lose the hole, Bill wins the hole. If the opponent's ball, now here's a specific provision that probably comes up more than you might think, but is really highlighted at the President's Cup, I guess it was just over 2 years ago. If the opponent's ball in motion needs to be holed to tie the hole, and that ball is deliberately deflected or stopped at a time when there's no reasonable chance it can be holed, such as after rolling past the hole, the result of the hole has been decided and the player wins the hole. So, for example, let's say that Bill is holed out for a 4. I have a putt for a 4, and I know I'm not going to leave it short. And I hit the ball hard, I miss the hole, and while the ball's 5 feet past the hole and still rolling away downhill, and it's clear it's not going to turn back, Bill, out of courtesy, knocks the ball back to me so I don't have to go retrieve it. First, as we'll see later, there's no penalty for what Bill did, and the result of the hole stands. So in that case, but it applies to that very specific set of facts that I was putting to tie Bill. Now, what if I've been putting to win the hole? That'd be different. But right now, just if I was putting to tie the hole and I miss, and it's clear the ball's not going to go into the hole, then there's no penalty if Bill knocks it back to me and Bill still wins the hole. Next section, when is a hole tied? Well, if the player and opponent complete the hole in the same number of strokes, so if Bill and I both make 4 on the hole's tied. Or if the player and opponent agree to treat the hole as tied, but this is allowed only after at least one of the players has made a stroke to begin the hole. So we could have a situation where, let's say, Bill and I are playing the 4th hole, and I hit my ball somewhere, and we simply cannot agree as to what the relief procedure is. And it's very, Bill thinks I have to go back to the teeing area. I think I get to drop on the green, and the relief procedure would dictate whether I would either win the hole or lose the hole. And we say, geez, we don't know what's right. So we just say, you know what, why don't we just say the hole's tied, move on. We can do that. Whether that's a good move strategically by both of us is another matter, but we could do that. But notice that this is allowed only after at least one of the players has made a stroke to begin the hole. So for example, so what that prohibits is, say, if Bill and I get to the first tee and we look at the sky and say, boy, that sky looks bad. Bill, how about if we can just consider, it looks like it's going to storm any second, but given our work schedules, we absolutely have to play this match today. Why don't we consider the first 17 holes tied, and let's just go to 18, and 18 will be for all the marbles. We can't do that. All right, next point, how does a player win a match? If the player leads the opponent by more holes than remain to be played. So if after the 16th hole, Bill is 3 up on me, match is over. Bill wins because he's 3 up with 2 to play. There's no point in our playing those last 2 holes. Or if the opponent concedes the match, could be, maybe I injure myself on the 4th hole. And I say, Bill, I'm not going to be able to finish. I concede. The match is yours. Or if the opponent's disqualified, that Bob winds up making a stroke with his magic 300-yard straight ball, winds up being disqualified, then his opponent wins the match. What happens if the match is tied after the final hole, which, as we've seen in most cases, will be 18 holes, but could be after 36 holes? Well, the match is extended 1 hole at a time until there is a winner. Now, a few key points there is that it extends on a hole-by-hole basis, and it is an extension of that same original round. It is not a new round. So why is that important? Let's say that Bill and I are playing a match after 18 holes, we're tied, and we have to go to the first hole to continue. What does that mean that I cannot do between the 18th green and the first tee? I can't change clubs. I can't stick my head in the golf shop and say, please help me. What am I doing with my putting stroke today? I can't, get advice from an unauthorized source. So that's important. It's an extension of the same round. And as we'll see in stroke play, a playoff in stroke play is different. Playoff in stroke play is a new round. And the holes are played in the same order as in the round unless the committee sets a different order. So if Bill and I are playing a match at River Club, we start on 1, then we're going to continue on 1. Sometimes committee might say differently, like for example, for television purposes, the committee might say, okay, starting in the quarterfinal round, if there's a tie after 18, players will go back to the 14th hole, perhaps television cameras are already in place to cover those holes. But it's important to note that the committee, it may always say that a tie is a tie, and that's okay, such as with the Ryder Cup. There's a tie, each side gets half a point. That's okay. But when you have something like, say, the state match play, you need to have a winner from each match. When is the result final? And this is an important point because, as we'll see under Rule 20, there are certain things that can and cannot be done after the result of a match is final. The result of a match becomes final in the way stated by the committee, which should say so up front. Some examples would be saying when the result is recorded on the official scoreboard, it could be a big scoreboard, or it could just be a bulletin board outside the golf shop, or other identified place, or when the result is reported to a person identified by the committee. So in either way, it's something the committee should say. And here's another useful reference to the committee procedures section that has some recommendations on what committees can do. And with two most important points being that, one, the committee needs to do something, two, the committee needs to do that before the competition starts. Next point that's unique to match play, Rule 3.2b, concessions. The player may concede the opponent's next stroke, hole, or the match. So let's look at each of these, starting with the next stroke. This is allowed any time before the next stroke is made, and after the concession, the opponent's considered to have completed the hole with a score that includes that conceded stroke, and the ball may be removed by anybody. So if Bill hits a putt up near the hole to 6 inches, and I say that's good, it's okay for me to knock it back to him. The concession made while the opponent's ball is still in motion after the previous stroke applies to the opponent's next stroke unless the ball is holed. Now that seems a little convoluted, but it's really there for practical reasons, for something that probably happens more than we might think. Let's say that Bill and I are playing, and I have a match against each other. I have a putt, and as the putt is just going past the hole, it's clear it's going to stop just a few inches by the hole, Bill says, "That's good, John." So what's he conceding? He's conceding that next stroke, that 4-inch putt I would have. The player may concede the opponent's next stroke by deflecting or stopping the opponent's ball in motion, only if that's done specifically to concede the next stroke, and only when there's no reasonable chance the ball can be holed. So if in that case I miss the ball's going past the hole, and Bill says, "That's good," or just that simple act, he knocks it back to me. I say, "Well, Bill, why'd you do that?" He said, "Oh, I was just conceding your next stroke." And that's fine, and there's no penalty. Ordinarily, as we'll see, players should not intentionally deflect balls in motion, but this is one case where that's okay. It's in match play, and Bill is conceding my next stroke. So now let's talk about conceding a hole. This is allowed anytime before the hole is completed, and could even take place before the players start a hole. But we do have an interpretation that says, to address the situation where Bill and I get the first tee and say, "Look, we're short on time. What do we could do?" If I say, "Bill, I'll concede of the first 16 holes, I'll concede the odds. If you concede the evens, then we can go to number 17 tied." We have interpretation saying you can't do that. But we could have a case where Bill and I are playing a match, and I am, let's say I am 2 up going into 17 at TPC, but I'm down to my last golf ball, and I know Bill is not. If I run out of balls, Bill's not going to let me borrow one from him because of what I said to him on the 4th hole. So I might say, "Bill, I concede the 17th hole. I mean, I'll take my chances being 1 up on the 18th hole, because I know if I hit it in the water on 17, I'm done."
Can you explain the differences where initially you can't do that and you can do that?
Yeah.
You have to know that it's conceding a hole versus considering a hole pass. And it's very important to understand what you're agreeing to. And I would say in general, if you're taking a test, all of Rule 3.2 A and B are hugely important. Know how a hole can be won, know how it can be tied, know how you win a match, extending a match. There's some questions that'll be asked on a test. It is important to know how a hole is won, the 3 bullet points, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question, especially because I can definitely understand, the raised eyebrow about, wait a minute, you can do something before a hole sometimes, but sometimes one player has to start a hole. What's the difference? And I think Bill put it well in that when you concede a hole, you're hurting yourself. You're shooting yourself in the foot. There's no benefit to that. Whereas if the two players agree to tie a hole, there could be some benefits to that are undesirable. But that's a very good question. Now, conceding the match. Oh no, this is allowed at any time before the result of the match is decided, including before the players start the match. So if, let's say, Bill and I are scheduled to play at 8 o'clock, I wake up, my back's killing me, I can't get out of bed, I can just call Bill and say, Bill, sorry, I'm not gonna be able to make it, I concede. And I can concede from my own house. That's okay. We could have a situation during the round where I, come injured and I concede, or out of pure frustration, because I'm 6 down after 9 holes, I can say, that's it, I'm out of here.
But John, does the same apply on tying a match? Can you agree to have the match before anybody strikes a match?
Oh, can you? Okay, good question. Can you agree to tie a match? And the answer to that is no. You are allowed to tie a hole, to agree to tie a hole once someone started the hole, but there are no provisions in the rules that allow for just a single instant of, say, agreeing to a tied match. I mean, there are things that could be done, that yield that result, such as, two players come to the 18th hole tied, and they say, this has been such a great match, there really shouldn't be a winner and a loser. Should we agree to tie 18? And it's a wider cup type format. Then that'd be okay.
You can't agree ahead of time.
Correct. You cannot agree ahead of, like on the first tee, to say, you know what, you're my buddy, I don't want to beat you, you don't want to beat me, let's just agree to tie. I can't do that. All right, how concessions are made. A helpful section that was added to the rules for 2019. A concession is made only when clearly communicated. And there is a great line, and a number of you have probably seen that WSGA publication, old publication, How to Conduct a Competition, that had a line, I think, that the late P.J. Boatwright wrote, said, when it comes to concessions, players often seem to conspire to silence, which, as a referee, is a very awkward situation. And, one reason why, when you're refereeing a match, two of the most important things you can tell players is that, one, order of play is very important. You need to play in the right order. And if you're not sure of the right order, ask me and I'll determine that. And also tell players to be very clear regarding a concession, so that a player, there isn't any doubt as to when a concession has been made. So a concession can be made either verbally or by an action, such as, a thumbs up telling the player to lift his ball or ball marker. If the opponent lifts the ball and breach a rule because of a reasonable misunderstanding that the player's statement or action was a concession, next stroke, ordinarily there's a penalty. Let's say, for example, if you lift your ball from the putting green without marking its spot. But there's no penalty in this case if it was a result of a reasonable misunderstanding and the ball must be replaced. So if I hit a putt up near the hole, Bill says, good. And Bill meant that was a good putt from 40 feet. But I thought Bill meant, no, that putt's good. And I lift my ball. And Bill says, whoa, John, what are you doing? That's not good. I haven't conceded. And I might shoot him a look, but then without penalty, I can just replace the ball and then play when it comes my turn. And then Bill has to hole out on all the remaining holes. A concession is final and cannot be declined or withdrawn. Applying handicaps in match play. Player and opponent should tell each other their handicaps before the match, so that way they can both strategize. So Bill can know he has to give me strokes on holes, 5, 7, and 12, or what have you. If the player declares a wrong handicap before or during the match and does not correct the mistake before the opponent makes his or her next stroke, then the result will depend as to whether that handicap was too high or too low. If it was too high, meaning that the player who gave the wrong handicap would stand to benefit from that, then the player is disqualified as long as that would affect the number of strokes the player gives or gets. If it does not, such as in a 4-ball type event where perhaps you're dealing with a percentage allowance, then there's no penalty. So that's pretty rare. In the great majority of circumstances, it would be a disqualification penalty. But if the declared handicap is too low, well, if the player is a 9 but says, "Oh, I'm a 7," then the player's just shot himself in the foot. There's no penalty. The player must play off the declared lower handicap. Where are the handicap strokes applied? Handicap strokes are given by hole. The lower net score wins the hole. Now, if there's a tied match in a handicap competition, then the handicap strokes are given by hole just as they were during the round. So, for example, if Bill and I are tied in the first, we have to go to the first hole, and the first hole is a handicap stroke hole of 13, but that doesn't apply. I don't get a stroke there. I don't get a stroke there. Each player is responsible for knowing the holes where he or she gives or gets handicap strokes. If the player mistakenly applies handicap strokes on a hole, the agreed result of the hole stands unless the players correct that mistake in time. So, for example, if after the third hole, if Bill and I correctly, before we teed off on the first hole, Bill and I correctly told each other our handicaps. And on the third hole, when we finish, Bill turns to me and says, "So, John, you win that hole with your handicap stroke?" And I say, "Yep, I did." And we both, out of ignorance, think that's correct, even though as it turned out, I really wasn't entitled to a stroke on that hole. Then we tee off on the next hole. We're walking down the fairway, and Bill says, "Oh, John, you really were not entitled to a stroke there." Then what do? Then, unfortunately for Bill, fortunately for me, that agreed result of the third hole would stand. But it'd be one thing if we're standing on the fourth tee, and before either one of us tees off, I say to Bill, "So, Bill, I won that hole with my stroke?" You said, "Yep." And Bill says, "Yes." And then, he has a doubt, pulls out a scorecard before either one of us tees off, says, No, you get your next stroke on the fourth hole, not on the third hole." I say, "Oh, okay. So we actually tied that hole." Then we've corrected that in a timely manner. All right, rule 3.2D, which is a big rule, covers a number of topics, and that's why you get rewarded with a break after this one. And it's one that's unique to match play, but it's a very important one for match play because it's because of its head-to-head nature. That what Bill does can directly affect what I do. That if I see Bill hit in the water, I might do something very different than if I see him hit on the green. If I know he lies 3 on the green, I might do something very differently than if I knew he lied 2 on the green. So it's important to know during play of the hole as well as during the match how things stand. At any time during the play of a hole or after the hole is completed, the opponent may ask the player for the number of strokes, and that would include both the strokes made and any penalty strokes incurred. And why? This is to allow the opponent to decide how to play the next stroke and the rest of the hole, or to confirm the result of the hole just completed. That if, staying on the 14th tee, if I'm, whether I'm 3 down or 2 down, could determine how I play the 14th tee shot. When asking for the number of strokes taken, or when giving that information without being asked. So first point is, if Bill says, "John, what do you lie?" I need to tell him. Or if I volunteer something, so if I'm just being a nice guy, if I'm over in the right trees making a mess of the hole, and I eventually get the ball back to the fairway, being a nice guy and wanting to be fully transparent, I might say, "Bill, just so you know, I now lie 4 in the fairway." But when I say that, I need to make sure I get that number correct. Now, the player must give the right number of strokes taken and a player who fails to respond to the request is treated as having given the wrong number of strokes. So if Bill's standing over his approach shot and it's his turn to play, and he says, John, what do you lie up there in the greenside bunker? And I say, I'm not going to tell you. And he says, no, you have to tell me. I said, no, I'll tell you after you hit. Say, no, you have to tell me now. And Bill finally goes ahead and plays. Then I'm treated as having given him an incorrect number of strokes. In either case, either the wrong number of strokes or a failure to answer the question is going to result in loss of hole. Unless the player corrects that mistake in time, because sometimes the player might say something and instantly correct it. So let's walk through that. Wrong number of strokes given while playing a hole. Player must give the right number of strokes taken before the opponent makes another stroke or takes a similar action, such as conceding the next stroke. So if Bill were to say to me, John, what do you lie? And I say, John, I lie 3. He says, okay. And then, but before he plays, I say, oh, no, Bill, I'm sorry, I actually lie 4. Then I've corrected that mistake, and that's okay. But he says, John, what do you lie? I say, I lie 3. Then he plays, and I say, oops, Bill, sorry, hindsight, I really lie 4. Then I'm going to be penalized. Or a time where you really have to be quick about things, about correcting the misstatements on the putting green. Let's say I have a long putt, I roll it up close to the hole. Bill's walking toward the hole to concede my next putt, but he hasn't conceded it yet. And he says, John, what do you lie? And I say, I lie 4. And he says, okay, well, in that case, then he picks up my ball and tosses it back to me. So in that case, that's good. But then I say, whoops, Bill, sorry, actually, I was 3 there. And in that case, I have not corrected that mistake in a timely manner and would lose the hole All right, now what happens if the wrong number of strokes given are given after the hole has been completed? Before either player makes a stroke to begin another hole or takes a similar action such as conceding the next hole or the match, or for the final hole before the result of the match is final. So let's say that after this 12th hole, Bill and I both hole out. We're walking to the 13th tee, and Bill says, John, what'd you make there? I said, I made 5. Bill says, okay. And then before either one of us tees off on the next hole, I say, oh, Bill, no, I'm sorry, I actually made 4 back there. Then I've corrected that mistake in a timely way. But here's an interesting exception, that there's no penalty for giving the wrong number of strokes if it had no effect on the result of the hole. So if the player gives the wrong number of strokes taken after the hole is completed, so this applies only after the hole is completed, but this does not affect this understanding of whether the hole is won, lost, or tied, there's no penalty. So let's say that Bill and I are walking off the 12th green, and Bill says, John, what'd you make? I said, Bill, I made 5. And he says, okay, well, you win the hole. But then I realized, whoops, no, I really made 4. But Bill made a 6. So either way, whether I made 4 or 5, Bill's understanding is what? That he lost the hole. So if I say I made 5 when I really made 4, then there's not going to be a penalty in that case. All right, now what happens when a player incurs a penalty? What are his obligations for letting the opponent know? Well, the player must tell the opponent about that penalty as soon as reasonably possible, taking into account how near the player is to the opponent and other practical factors. And we have an interpretation 3.2D, 2/1, that tells us that as soon as reasonably possible does not always mean before the opponent's next stroke. That because we could have a situation where, say, I'm miles to the right in the trees, Bill's in the middle of the fairway, and I believe the interpretation uses the example where a player has, do it real quick, has proceeded under, has taken unplayable ball relief. That, where the player's taken unplayable ball relief, when the opponent's on the opposite side of the fairway and the opponent plays before the player can walk over to tell the opponent about the penalty. In this case, as soon as possible, as soon as reasonably possible, maybe while they're walking up to the hole to make their next strokes. And then the second bullet point makes an important point by saying this requirement applies even if the player does not know about the penalty, because players are expected to recognize when they've breached a rule. So this is where it can get a little interesting. That let's say I don't know the rules very well. Bill and I are playing a match, and I do something, and I have no idea it's a breach of the rules. But I don't tell Bill about that penalty. And let's say it was just a one-stroke penalty. If I don't tell Bill about that penalty in a timely manner, then I'm going to lose the hole. Some people say, well, wait a minute, how can you penalize John for not telling Bill about the penalty when he didn't even know there was a penalty? Well, because why? Players are expected to know the rules, and they're expected to recognize when they have breached the rules. So that is my own fault. And as we'll see later, especially under Rule 20, that can be an important point as to when Bill can request a ruling about something that happened on a previous hole. So if the player fails to do so, either to tell the player about the penalty as soon as reasonably possible, and does not correct that mistake before the opponent makes another stroke or takes similar action, the player gets the general penalty. Now, there is an exception to that, and that is if the opponent knew of the player's penalty, the player is not going to be penalized for failing to tell the player of that penalty. So let's say, for example, that Bill and I are playing on a hole. I hit my tee shot into a red penalty area. Bill sees me measure the 2 club lengths to take relief from the red penalty area and plays on. Bill has seen me take relief from the red penalty area, so he knows what I've done then. Because I was obviously taking penalty relief. All right, now knowing the match score. Players are expected to know the match score. So for example, if Bill is 2 up after 8 holes, but if the players mistakenly agree on a wrong match score, they may correct the match score before either player makes a stroke to begin another hole, or if it's a final hole before the result is final. And if it's not corrected in that time, then the wrong match score becomes the actual match score. So let's say, for example, after the 6th hole, Bill asked me as we're walking off the green, John, are you 1 up? I say, yep, you bet it. You better believe it. And then we're standing on the 7th tee before one of us tees off. Bill says, John, actually, I think we're all tied. And we go through it, and I say, oh, gosh, Bill, yeah, you're right. Okay, we're tied. And that's okay. We start the 7th hole tied. But if Bill realizes that walking down the 7th fairway, then what happens? Then I was 1 up after 6. That mistakenly agreed upon match score would stand. There's a necessary exception for that, and that is if a player makes a timely request for a ruling and it's found out that the opponent either gave the wrong number of strokes taken or failed to tell the player about the penalty, then the wrong match score would be corrected. And we'll go through some examples with that under rule when we cover Rule 20. Protecting own rights and interests. And this is a nice kind of statement of philosophical statement for match play. Players in a match should protect their own rights and interests under the rules. If a player knows or believes the opponent's breached a rule that has a penalty, the player may act on the breach or choose to ignore it. But if the player and opponent deliberately agree to ignore a breach or penalty they know applies, both players are disqualified. So a little bit. Yeah. Let's go through that, because there is a fine line, and it's an important line. It's an important line between no penalty and disqualification. It's a little bit similar to the example earlier with Phil and me, where I had too many clubs. Well, let's take another example where, let's say Bill and I are playing a match, and on the 6th hole, Bill sees me. I'm playing from a bunker, and during my backswing, I brushed the sand, which I'm not allowed to do. So in match play, ordinarily, that's a loss of hole penalty. You know, Bill, let's say Bill knows that's a penalty, but he says, geez, you know, I'm already 4 up. I feel kind of bad for John. I'm just going to say nothing. So he could choose to ignore that, and that would be okay. That's his choice. But then once we tee off on the next hole, if 6 holes later, if I rally and now I'm 1 up, he can't say, oh, John, by the way, remember what you did back there? That's not right. He can't do that, but he can choose to ignore that. But what he may not do is to say, come up to me, say, John, you touched the sand with your backswing. That's a loss of hole penalty, but I'm a nice guy. I'm not going to apply that penalty. And if I say, Bill, gosh, you're swell, thank you. And we go on, then what have we done? He and I have agreed not to apply that penalty. So then we're disqualified, because as soon as he raises that to me and I agree with him not to apply that penalty, we're subject to disqualification. So then the question is, what should Bill do if he wants to be a super nice guy and, one, not apply the penalty, but also he wants to make sure I know the rules so that I don't breach it down the road? What can he do? Yeah, exactly. What Bill can do is, if this happened during play of the 6th hole, he can say nothing. Then once we tee off on the 7th hole, while we're walking down the fairway, he can say, John, just so you know, for future reference, when you're in a bunker, you're not allowed to touch the sand with your backswing. Because at that point, and I say, gosh, okay, thanks, Bill, I didn't know that, but I'll make sure I don't do that again. At that point, it's impossible. It's too late for a penalty to be applied. So he and I are not agreeing not to apply a penalty. Well, it seems like a workaround, and it is a workaround. But it's a workaround that's a rule that's allowed, but it gets to, the desired result. Because the important part is, in that case, it's too late for a penalty to be applied.
Keep in mind that players a lot different concept and not the timing of the information. When you get to the next bullet point, I think that makes sense.
Let's see.
The last
The very last bullet point. If the player and opponent disagree whether one of them has breached a rule, either player may protect his or her rights by asking for a ruling under Rule 20.1b. So let's take that case where Bill sees me touch a sand in the bunker. He says, John, that's a breach of the rules. You lose the hole. I say, Bill, you don't know what you're talking about. They've changed the rules. That's now allowed. And we know that's wrong. But we can't agree as to what to do. What happens? Well, Bill's allowed to make a request for a ruling. We'll see under Rule 20, how he goes about doing that, time in which he has to make that request, and then how we proceed, in terms of he has to make that request within a certain time window, and then we present it to a member of the committee whenever we come across one. Say 2 holes later, if we come across one, then Bill says, hey, back on number 6, John did this, this, and this. What's the ruling? All right, so that's Rule 3.2, which is a match play rule. Important parts: concession, handicaps, and number of strokes taken in the state of the match. Any questions about that? All right, if not, let's see, why don't we have a penalty, not a penalty, why don't we have a break? Shall we resume? 10-minute break. We'll start at 9:55. All right.
All right, good. Yeah. Was that John, the story, was it Mary B, was the story that you tell about the girls junior where she was trying to give relief to a young, he used the example, she was trying to give relief to a girl.
All right. Welcome back. John, just before Dan gets started, I wanted to talk about one question that Dan or that someone listening had asked, and that was to go over when players agree to concede holes, if that is allowed. And with that, I just refer to interpretation 3.2b. 1/1, which is on page 39 of the official guide, which says that players may not agree to concede holes to each other to deliberately shorten a match. And it goes on to say that if they know they're not allowed to do that and they go ahead and do that, then they're going to be disqualified. If they just think they're being clever and are not aware that they're not allowed to do that, then the match would stand as played. Right, and on to Dan.
No hand.
Just so everybody know, John Morissette did not get a hand when he started. All right, we're gonna do 3-3, and then we're gonna do 4, and then when we get done with 4, assuming we have some time, Bill's gonna go over a few of the questions for the exam. So let's look at 3.3, which is stroke play. And you'll notice that this is one of the sub-rules that actually has a purpose statement that's sort of a tip-off that the WSGA or the drafters of the rules almost view this as a separate rule from 3.2 because you have a different purpose statement. And that's, so let's look at that. Stroke play has specific rules, particularly for scorecards and holing out, because each player competes against all the other players and all players need to be treated equally under the rules. That's a substantial difference from the match play. After the round, the player in the marker who keeps the player's score must certify the player's score for each hole is right, and the player must return the scorecard. All right, 3.38, winning in stroke play. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. The player who completes all rounds, so that would cover a 2-round tournament, or whether it was a 3 or 4-round tournament. And the fewest strokes, including penalty strokes, is the winner. And handicap, it means the net. The blue language, terms of the competition, should say how. We have a note that says something like playoff will be decided on the holes set by the committee immediately upon completion of the round. Words of that effect. And the reason that's done is because the WSGA is often a guest of courses. We don't own the courses, so if we're at a private course, they maybe want the members to go. If we have a public course, the people want to make some money. So often the decision on where the playoff will be held is determined by where there's no people on the course, which can be on the 18th hole or the 17th hole or whatever. I do remember we had one at Erin Hills, and the playoff, I think that was for a high school tournament, as I recall, and we went to the 9th hole. And the reason we went to the 9th hole is at Erin Hills, it's a long walk to go to any hole. And we went to 9, and as I recall, we did it at least 5 times, maybe 6 times. And we had 2 high school kids go up and down the hill because they kept making 3. 3.3b, scoring in stroke play. The player's score is kept on a scorecard by the marker who is either identified by the committee or chosen by the player in a way approved by the committee. I think John mentioned this, almost always when you start a round, the scorer will hand the scorecards to the players. You have 3, and then we'll say either something like pass them to the player on your left, or you will specifically assign John to do Doug's and Doug's to do Bill's and so forth. The player must use the same marker for the entire round unless the committee approves a change either before or after it happens. This is a nice change in the rules. What this says is if you have a situation where the marker leaves the course, we had this at the State Open, we had a rain delay, it was the last day. A couple people knew for sure they weren't going to make the cut, so they didn't show up when we resumed play. So there's a guy on the 17th hole in the middle of the fairway standing by himself with no one around. And I said, well, where's everybody else? And he says, well, I don't have any idea. Well, we had to assign a marker, so we had one of the players, I forget what we did, I think we went to the green and said, you're going to mark for the guy that is in the fairway. If the official hadn't been around, it would be incumbent upon the player himself to make sure that he had a marker, and that means he would probably have to drop back or wait with the group behind and then ask one of them to mark for it. All right, 3.3b, parent 1, marker's responsibility, entering and certifying hole scores on scorecard. We made this comment a number of times last year, and I'm going to make it again, and I'm going to do it continuously. The headings of the new rules are particularly insightful as to what the rule says. It doesn't just say this is the marker's responsibility. The title itself basically says this is what it is. And some of these rules, you almost don't need to read the rule because the title is so good. So look what it says. The marker's responsibilities, entering and certifying hole scores. That's it. So there's probably only 2 things. And so look what it says. After each hole during the round, the marker should confirm with the player the number of strokes on that hole, including penalty strokes, and enter it on the scorecard. Notice the word should. We're going to be talking about this, and Bill will talk about this when we talk about taking exams. Should is a suggestion. When you see the word must, that is mandatory. So should is suggestion, must is mandatory. So you don't have to do that. I've been in a scoring tent where a player will come in and the marker hands the card to the player, and the player looks at it and says, well, you didn't put the last, what'd you have in the last 4 holes? 4, 4, 4, 5. So then he writes 4, 4, 4, 5. There's no violation because he accompanied the player for the full round, and the should is not mandatory. He should do it, but he doesn't have to. So what does he have to do? The marker must, and that is that's mandatory. The marker must certify the hole scores on the scorecard. If the player has more than 1 marker, each marker must certify the scores for those holes where he or she was the marker. So you can have a situation where a player quits after 7 holes for whatever reason, bad back or whatever. That other player has to have a marker for the rest of the hole. But before the marker goes, he should draw a line 1 through 7, sign his signature, and then when you get into the scoring tent, the second marker should draw a line from 8 to 18, certifying that. You look at the diagram on 3.3b, the pink color, I don't know if that's pink or whatever you call that. Salmon, Bill says that's salmon. You'll notice that the salmon color is for, quote, the player and the marker. Then when you look at the signature, it says marker's signature. So the concept is the marker has to do 2 things. He has to enter the score and he has to sign the scorecard. That is the so-called certification. That's all the marker needs to do. There's no specific requirement that the number in the box must be handwritten by the marker. That is a very good practice. You should insist upon it. But it is possible when you get into the scoring tent, if the last hole is not filled in and the marker said, boy, I forgot to put down what you had in the last hole, and the player says, well, I got the card here. I had a 4. Do you agree? He says, yes. He writes in 4. You then certify it. Player's responsibility. Again, notice the heading. Certify hole scores and return scorecard. So before you read it, you should say to yourself, that's what this is all about. That's all the player has to do. During the round, the player should, and again, there's that word where it's suggestive, it's not mandatory, should keep track of his or her score for each hole. You don't have to. It's a good policy, but you don't have to. And then look at the 4 bullet points. The first one, should carefully check the hole scores entered by the marker and raise any issues with the committee. You don't have to. The marker hands you it and there's a score in each of the 18 holes and you sign it, you're good to go. You may be disqualified if it's incorrect, but you don't technically have to check the hole scores. But then look at the next 3 bullet points. You must make sure that the marker certifies, meaning the marker has signed it. You must not change a hole score entered by the marker, except with the marker's agreement or the committee's approval. And you must certify the hole scores on the scorecard and promptly return it to the committee, after which the player must not change the scorecard. So you can be in the scoring tent, you can have a 4 on a hole, and you look to the marker and you say, I had a 3 on that hole, and the marker says, oh, yeah, I guess that's right. You then erase it, you put down a 3, and you're set to go. There is no requirement of the new rules, and the very technical stuff has been eliminated. There's no requirement that you therefore initial some sort of change. The only thing you have to do before you make the change is get the approval of the other certifier, which is the marker. All right. Notice that if you don't do those, there's no, you're disqualified. So what do you do if you're in scoring? You just got to have 2 things. You got to have a score in each of the 18 holes, and you got to have 2 signatures. That's it. Now, if you got a net event, you're going to have to worry about the handicap. But in a gross tournament, all you got to have is 18 individual scores and 2 signatures.
Scorecard without the marker signature, and that's what it's brought to the attention of the player. They're like, well, that's not my fault.
Yeah.
And I always point to the rule where it says you must make sure that the marker, because it says when the round is ended, the player, not the marker, the player must ensure that the marker. So it's, you're certifying someone else's action, and that responsibility is the player's, not the marker's.
And notice the exception. There's no penalty when the breach is due to the marker's failure to carry out the responsibility. Again, there's no penalty if the committee finds that the player's breach was caused by the marker's failure to carry out, such as marker leaving with the player's scorecard or failing to certify the whole scores. There's an interpretation that says it directs the committee to use its best efforts to find the marker, but at the end of the day, if the marker truly is gone, the committee has the authority to certify it without the marker's approval. But again, if you are in the scoring tent, you never go anywhere unless you get 2 signatures or you get the committee to say this thing is certified. John, you got a question? Why bother with the rule? It's a good question. Why do we give an exception? Why not have the rule? Well, you have the obvious problem if the marker, for whatever reason, gets disgusted and leaves. It really is not the player's fault. He can't tackle the player. He can't physically get him. And so you got to do with what you got to do. The other thing that's interesting about this rule, it says the committee, there's interpretation, it says the committee must or may certify it. I don't know whether the committee has to, let's say Bill is in the scoring tent, does Bill have to physically sign it? What is the certification process by the committee? John, do you have an opinion on that? So the score, the committee, assume it's Bill or John, but then, or Thomas or Jeff. All right. Next page, wrong score for hole. If the player returns a scorecard with a wrong score for any hole, you return a score higher than actually taken, the higher score stands. If you return it for a lower score, you're going to be disqualified. And then there is the exception, and this exception has now gone through 3 or 4 iterations over the last 4 or 5 years. Up until 2016, if you turned in the wrong score, it was too low, you were disqualified. Then, for a couple years, we had the situation, and you think of Lexi Thompson when she played at Nabisco, she put her, she replaced her ball on the putting green. She apparently did not put it in the wrong, she put it in the wrong spot, so therefore she got a 2-stroke penalty. The way the rule was written at that time, you got an additional 2-stroke penalty because she didn't follow the scorecard rule. So she wound up getting a 4-stroke penalty for putting a ball back on the putting green no more than a half an inch from where it should have been. Under the new rule, Lexi Thompson or the equivalent would still get the original 2-stroke penalty for the wrong plays, but the exception takes away the additional 2-stroke penalty for the scorecard. So let's go through how it works. If one or more players' hole scores are lower than the actual score, because he or she excludes one or more penalty strokes that the player did not know, the player is not disqualified. Instead, if the mistake is found before the close of the competition, the committee will revise. In other words, they will add the penalty strokes. Notice that this applies only to penalty strokes, not to talent strokes. So if you are on the 18th hole and you write down that you had a 4 and you actually had a 5, and the reason that you had a 5 was not because you got a penalty, but because you duffed a shot in the middle of the fairway and your mind went blank, you're not trying to cheat, you just forgot about that. You turn in that score, you're disqualified because you do not come under the exception, because it is not due to a penalty stroke, it's due to a talent stroke. Scoring and handicap, parent 4. Player is responsible for making sure that his or her handicap is shown on the scorecard. If the player returns the scorecard without the right handicap, if it's too high, you're going to be disqualified, and if it's too low, you're going to have to play with the handicap. What I find interesting about this is, with the simplification of the scorecard procedure, they still have the requirement that that it is the player's responsibility, not the committee's, to have the right handicap. The term handicap, and there's an interpretation that makes this clear, is the course handicap. And while this seems odd to me, let's assume your handicap is your index is a 6.5. You look it up on the computer, you know it's 6.5. You're happy to certify that it's a 6.5. But that's not what the rule requires. The rule requires you to be able to eventually certify that the course handicap is correct. So I take my 6.5, I'm playing in a tournament. The course handicap is the course, let's say it's Erin Hills, and it's the green tees. And I could, instead of being a 7, I could be an 8, I could be a 9, I could be a 10, depending on, I suppose, if I'm playing the tips at Erin Hills, that could be a 17 handicap. It is the player's responsibility. Now, when the WSGA hands out the scorecards for the net events, the course handicap is already on there. And Bill and Jeff and Thomas do a great job on that, but it's the player's responsibility. So in theory, you have to get your app out, check the course, check the tees that you're playing for, and verify that it truly is an 8 not a 7 or a 9 or whatever.
Just to clarity, we play with the amount, and as I see the interpretation, it says that the player is responsible for the court. I asked this out loud when I'm sure you said
When you apply the 90%.
Yeah. Yeah.
John Warren.
And just so everybody knows, what that means is if you, let's say I go to the course and the course determines that for this course, for these set of tees with my handicap, I am a 6. Then the committee determines that because of the format, they're going to play at 90% of a stroke. I would still be a 6 because 90% of, I'm sorry, I'd be a 5. No, I'd be a 6, wouldn't I?
No.
All right. So I got to be a 5.
Or you can just qualify every net partners winner
All right.
for the last 20 years for failure.
Can't do it after the competition.
You may not know that, but even in individual competition for 2020, like our senior tour event, the percentage is now 95, not 100. And it gets even cloudier when you go into other forms of play, which I don't want to suggest. But I find it interesting because the interpretation says handicap means the handicap for the course is played, excluding any handicap allowances.
You know what, if you're a player in that tournament, and the committee has set up the course not according to the course's posted tees, but has made adjustments.
Whether or not adjustments are made, there is a course rating and slope for that. And you would have a course handicap for the, and there's a mathematical formula, but anyway. What is, we call it the tournament handicap, which is your course handicap with the allowance adjustment. You know, do this in, like the pro-ams are probably 2 out of 4, which is now 85, not 90. And so we've included the handicap allowance on the number we display. Well, we have the person's handicap index. And the tournament handicap, or what is 2020 will be called the playing handicap, but not the court handicap, which in looking at this as he moves, he's just playing the court.
Yeah. And again,
we could probably put the court handicap next to the handicap and the playing handicap, because really they want to know what the playing handicap and what I call the playing.
That's interesting. That's going to be a Jen or that's a Google thing because you just punch those in and calculate that.
It is, but it should be interesting. I mean, if we can play the index and the playing handicap, how could we not? I mean, the playing handicap percent. It's reverse,
yeah, but again, the point here is it is the player's responsibility. If you look at back at diagram 3.3b, it is the player, it's the yellow, and it says a 5 handicap. The player's got to make sure that that's correct. And if for whatever reason it's not, you could be disqualified. You would be disqualified.
and that applies whether or not the committee puts the handicap on the scorecard.
Yes. And then the last thing about 3.3 on stroke play is parent 5, a player is not responsible for adding score or applying a handicap. So in other words, they just have to have a score in 18 individual hole scores. They don't have to add it up that it comes to 72. And then let's look at 3.3C, failure to hole out. We're talking stroke play. Player must hole out at each hole in a round. If the player fails to hole out at any hole, the player must correct the mistake before making a stroke to begin another hole, or for the final hole or round before returning the scorecard. This was the change for 2019, which was a very good change, that you, on the 18th hole, you only have to correct it before you turn in your scorecard. I can almost guarantee if you want to take the national exam, that there'll be a question on the national exam that'll be reading something like the following. A player finishes his 18th hole, gets distracted, fails to putt out, goes to the scoring tent, and it's brought to his attention that he did not putt out. Is the player disqualified? The answer is no, because the player still can go back to the 18th hole, find his mark, and putt it in. If the player can't find his mark, he's going to estimate the spot and place it there. If the player had picked it up without marking, then he's going to get a one-stroke penalty. We'll see that. You either put the ball or the ball marker back, but you're not going to be disqualified.
As long as you have that return.
That's correct. The question almost always going to be you're in the scoring tent and the issue has been arising. All right, let's look at 4. And as John started this discussion off, the main purpose of this is so that our WSGA rules officials know how to correctly rule. The second part of this is to make sure that our rules officials get the highest score they can on the national exam, because many of the rules officials want to officiate at various events. And if you get at least a 90 on the national exam, you then get the highest rating that the USGA gives. So one of our goals is to encourage people to take the national exam, which is in Milwaukee this year, and to score high. And that's the reason why we're going to kind of go over some of the tips, and Bill's going to do that at the end. Before we look at 4, I want to very briefly go over something that may not be so obvious. We are talking about using only the book, the rules book, to go over. Many people have the official guide in front of them. When you read a rule, there are at least 5 other places that you have to look in order to know what the rule says. So, example, 3.3B, C, B, that's what 3.3. So, for those who have the official guide, if you look under 3.3B, and then it'll be under parent 1, marker's responsibility. You then go in the book and you'll see that there are 3 or 4 interpretations, or there's 2. You go to the next one, there's a couple more. So under each sub part, there may be interpretations. The thing to bear in mind is there are also what are known as general interpretations that are going to be at the end of 3.3B. So if you have the official guide, if you look at page 53, you will see that in addition to the 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 interpretations, we now have what are called general interpretations that are 4 or 5 pages behind where the other ones are. What this suggests is anytime you are looking for interpretations, you've got to look not just for the very subpart rule, but the general rule, because there are interpretations for that. The third thing you need to look at is that you need to look at the interpretations that are found in the definitions. This is new for 2019. We never had interpretations in the definitions. So those interpretations then can be in 3 different places. And then, of course, we have the clarifications, which are the USGA's clarifications, interpretations that they issue quarterly, started at the end of 2018. And finally, we have to look to the model local rules. So those are just 5 things that we sort of need to keep in mind when we talk about what does the rule actually say. All right, sorry to get off on the side of that. So let's look at 4. Player's equipment. The purpose of the rule. Rule 4 covers the equipment the player may use during the round. So that first sentence is very important. It says use during the round. It does not say carry, it says use. And we're going to see under Rule 4, if you learn nothing else in Rule 4, this is the key. You're only going to get a penalty if you use a ball or a club that doesn't, or a piece of equipment that doesn't conform. You're not going to get one if you just carry it. So you must use conforming clubs and balls. You're limited to 14 clubs, and there's restrictions on the use. So let's look at 4.1, which are clubs. 4.1a. Again, notice the heading. It says clubs allowed in making a stroke. It does not say clubs allowed that you may carry on the course. It says clubs allowed in making a stroke. Parent 1, conforming clubs. In making a stroke, again, there's the concept. A player must use a club that conforms to the requirements of the equipment rule. A club used to make a stroke must conform not only when it's new, but if it's been deliberately or accidentally changed. The good way to think of that is an adjustable club, you deliberately change it. But if the performance characteristics of a conforming club change because of wear, it's still a conforming club. So wear is the normal use, which can include putting a club into a bag, provided that you do not abuse it. If you set the club in the bag and you get a little change in the loft, that club's still conforming. Sub 2, use or repair of clubs damaged during round. If a conforming club is damaged during a round or while play is stopped, the player normally must not replace it with another club. And then there's a limited exception, and we're going to talk about another exception because in WSGA events we have modified the rule. But this is an example. If you're taking the national exam, you have to know the rule because that's what they're going to ask you about, even though the WSGA, as we're going to see in just a minute, plays under a model local rule that changes the local rule. Let's go on. But no matter the nature or cause of the damaged club is treated as conforming for the rest of the round, but not in a stroke playoff. So what does that mean? That means you're on the 7th hole, you're playing a tournament, you miss a short putt, you take that putter and you crack it over your knee and the thing looks like a horseshoe now. Well, obviously that's not a conforming club. What this says is for the rest of that round, you can continue to use that club, even though it is non-conforming, and even though the reason it's non-conforming is because you abused it. It's changed from the old rule, so you can do that. And at the top of the page in 37, it says for the rest of the round, you can continue to make strokes with the damaged club, or you can have the club repaired as nearly as possible. When you're going to repair it, you can't unreasonably delay, and you can't repair damage that existed before the round. So there's an interpretation that talks about repair. Let me give you one example of what would be considered a repair. You put lead tape on your club before you start. During the round, the lead tape comes off. You then put it back on and it no longer sticks because it doesn't have any stick left. The term repair would allow you to put an identical piece of lead tape on. You can't put more, you can't put less, you can't put it in a different spot. You can just put a new piece of lead tape on, and that is considered a repair.
Dan?
Yeah.
So using your putter example, could you have it sent to the pro shop, and while it's in there, you putt with your driver, and then when they fix it, they bring it back out, and now you putt with your putter again? Is that allowable?
It says the player must not unreasonably delay. In your example, I guess the player isn't doing anything. I'm not sure how you would repair that to get it to conform. Although you can still continue to play it even though it doesn't. So you can bend it yourself back as much as you want, and you can continue to use that for the rest of that round. The problem is if you start the next round, that club is not going to be conforming.
Or you could have the pro shop rebend it straight, but they could not change the shaft or the grip or the head.
John, I think that's right. You
Yeah,
agree with that? Yeah.
that's right. Because if you change that, then you're considered.
The three things that you can't change are the grip, the shaft, and the club head. All right. Parent 3, deliberately changing club's performance characteristics during a round. A player must not make a stroke. And again, I want to emphasize it one more time. On the national exam, there'll probably be a question that goes as follows. A player on the third hole, having hit his first two tee shots left out of bounds, adjusts his driver to go from a hook to a slice. And then the question is going to be, does the player get a penalty for that? And the answer is no, the player does not get a penalty because there is no penalty for deliberately changing the playing characteristics of the club. There's only a penalty if you make a stroke at a club whose playing characteristics have been deliberately changed. And when you look at sub 3, it says, bullet point number 1, by using an adjustable feature, and B, by applying any substance to the club head other than in cleaning it to affect how it performs in making a stroke. And then the exception is the adjustable club can be restored to its original position. So, example, you're on the third tee, you've hit 2 balls out of bounds, you adjust the club from a hook to a slice with the adjustable feature on your driver. Someone says to you, you can't do that, you haven't made a stroke, you put it back. The exception is saying you can put it back and there's no penalty and you can make a stroke with it. Take this situation, you're on the third teeing area, you hit 2 out of bounds, and so you want to put some Vaseline on it to hopefully hit the ball, go nice and straight. So you put it on, someone says you can't do that, you say, oh, that's right. You clean all the stuff off of it and you're ready to go, you make your stroke, you're disqualified. Why? Because that's something that you cannot correct. Once you have put salve on a club that changes its performance characteristics, that club cannot be used because you have deliberately changed the club's performance characteristics.
But if you do it and don't use it and it's in your bag, you're okay.
That's exactly right. And I would not be surprised if that's precisely the question you would get on a national exam. And then the player is told he can't use it, so he puts it in his bag, or whatever he does with it. And notice the penalty is severe. For making a stroke and breach of 4.1a, it's disqualification. And then the final 2 bullet points are just what we talked about. There's no penalty under this rule for merely having the club. The penalty is for making the stroke. And then the final bullet point, it's still going to count in the 14 club rule. So let's go to the 14 club rule, which is on the top of page 38. 4.1b, you're limited to 14 clubs, sharing or adding or replacing clubs during a round. The second thing you need to know about Rule 4 is anytime you see the 14 club rule on a national exam, a red flag should go up because there are 3 differences between this and any other rule. We're going to go through those, but you got to know that this is a special animal. So let's go through it. Player must not start a round with more than 14 clubs or have more than 14 clubs during the round. If you start with fewer than 14, you can add up to 14 And when the player becomes aware that he or she is in breach by having more than 14 clubs, the player must immediately, and I would circle the word immediately, take the excess clubs out of play by using a procedure. We're going to go over the procedure. So it requires you to immediately take it out of play. And we're going to see it's the severe consequence if you don't honor the word immediately. Then there is the nice catch-all paragraph at the end, which is the Good Golfer Award. After the player's round is started, if a player picks up another player's club that was left behind, or the club is mistakenly put in the player's bag without his or her knowledge, the club is not treated as the player's club for purposes of 14. So if you're on the fourth green and you're putting and you see somebody left their wedge there, you can pick that club up, put it in the cart, put it in your bag. You can't use it, and then give it to a rules official or the player, whoever lost it. But you can actually carry that club with you. It used to be in a decision. It's now part of the rules. Parent 2, no sharing of clubs. A player is limited to those clubs he or she started with, and the player must not make a stroke with a club being used by anyone else playing on the course. Again, the word must not make a stroke. Does that mean that you can grab somebody else's club, put it in your bag? Yes, you can play with it, have fun with it. But what you can't do is that you can't make a stroke. And the term stroke means a stroke that counts in the score. So an example would be if you borrow someone's club, you hit a drive. Let's say you're on the 7th hole at, what is that course? The Conomowoc, and you hit your drive to the left, and you think, geez, that one may be out of bounds. And you've hit your driver. Then you grab your partner's driver, and then you hit that right down the middle. That's your provisional ball. When you get up there, if you find the other one, you're in good shape, you're lying one. If you don't, then you got to deal with the fact that you've breached this rule. And if it's a non-conforming club, you're going to be disqualified. If you use the other one, it's going to be a 2-stroke penalty. And then you look at the blue language at the bottom of that. It talks about Rule 22.5 and 23.7. Limitation in partner form of play, which is foursomes and 4-ball. You are allowed to share, but understand that it's no more than a total of 14. Another one is often to be on the exam. One partner has 13 clubs, the other one has 13 clubs. Can you borrow one from the other one? The answer is no, because the total that you share as partners can only be 14. And in this case, if they each have 13, their total is 26. All right, 3. No replacing lost or damaged club. If a player starts with 14 clubs or adds clubs up to the 14 club limit, then loses or damages a club during the round or while play is stopped, the player must not replace it with another club. Then there's the exception at the top of the page that says replacing damaged club, and the exception is that if it's damaged by someone other than you, an outside agency that runs over it, you're going to be able to replace the club, and then you have to declare the damaged club out of play. Notice that when you are in WSGA events, the WSGA has adopted Model Local Rule G9, which is the rule that says, contrary to Rule 4.1b3, you can replace a club. There's a question online. It says, if a player puts Vaseline on a club, cleans it off, does not use it for the rest of the round, is the player DQ'd? What's the group say on that? Does not use it for the rest of the round. Remember, the fundamental purpose of Rule 4 is you're only going to be disqualified if you make a stroke. Thanks, Bill. So again, nice reminder, Rule 4, you're disqualified if you make a, only if you make a stroke. Again, notice that when you replace a club and you declare the other one out of place, you must do so immediately. Again, we're going to go over that word immediately. All right, parent 4. Restrictions when adding or replacing a club. You may do it, you may not do it if it's unreasonable delay of play. You add or borrow any club from anyone else who is playing on the course, or you build a club from parts carried by anyone for a player during the round. So let's take this situation. You are just about to tee off, you're on the putting green, and John and I are excited, we're playing in the tournament. I have the 8 o'clock starting time. I almost said 8 o'clock starting time. John has the 8:10, and instead of putting, we're kind of chit-chatting and not paying attention. All of a sudden, they call my name, I gotta go. So I go, I take my clubs, and I see the wedge sitting on the ground, which I assume is mine. It's actually John's. I put it in my bag, and I go to the first hole, and I tee off. First question, am I in trouble? Yes, because I started with 15 clubs. Now, what about John's wedge? Can John get that wedge back for the rest of the round? And the answer is no. Why? Because it is a club that is being used by someone else on the course. So does that mean that John can only play with 13? No, it just means that he started with only 13 because I took his wedge by mistake, and he can add any other club to get up to 14. What he can't do is he can't add a club that's being used on the course by anyone else. And I think this came up in a WSGA event a couple of years ago where it was almost that same situation. And we had to tell the player that he couldn't use the wedge. So in this case, John would be without his wedge for the rest of the round. All right, the penalty under 4.1b, and this is the 14 club rule, this is significant for 2 reasons. One, I believe it is the only adjustment penalty left in the rules of golf. So that's important. And the second thing you got to know about it, it's the only one that I'm aware of. If the breach is between the holes, you apply it to the last hole, not to the previous hole. So again, if you're ever seeing a national exam, it's a 14 club rule, the red flag should go off. So let's go through that. Player becomes aware of breach while playing the hole. The penalty is applied at the end of the hole being played. In match play, the player must complete the hole, apply the result of the hole to the match, and then apply the penalty adjustment. Next bullet point. Player becomes aware of the breach between holes. The penalty is applied as of the end of the hole just completed, not the next hole. Under the old rules, we had 3 or 4 different adjustment penalties. We're down to just this one, and it's the 14 club rule. Under the old rules, we had times when you applied the penalty that was between holes, sometimes to the last hole and sometimes to the next hole. Under the new rules, you're always going to apply it to the next hole, except when you got the 4.1 14 club rule. How does this work? Bullet point 3 gives a wonderful example. It says, for example, if a player who started with 15 clubs becomes aware of the breach while playing the 3rd hole, and then wins that hole to go 3 up in the match, the maximum adjustment of 2 holes applies, and the player would now be 1 up in the match. So again, the key to understand it is an adjustment penalty. So if you play 9 holes and you're 9 down, and you have 15 clubs in your bag, you're done for the day, because you are now 11 down with 9 holes to go. And again, it's a maximum of 2 holes. Stroke play, it's a maximum of 4. We're going to talk about 4.1c. procedure for taking club out of play. Bear in mind this situation. You've now played 9 holes in stroke play. You discover you got 15 clubs. You say to yourself, why should I do anything? I can't do any worse than 4 strokes, so I'm not going to do anything. Yeah, I got 15 clubs, but so what? Let's find out what happens. 4.1c, during a round, when a player becomes aware during a round that he or she is in breach of the 14 club rule, the player must immediately take an action that clearly indicates each club that is being taken out of play. And this can be done by declaring this to the opponent in match play or taking some other action such as turning the club upside down. Obviously, the best way to do it is to verbally state to the person you're playing with that you're taking the club out of play. So what does the term immediately mean? There's no interpretation on that, but I would say if you're on the 15th tee and you discover for the first time that you have 15 clubs, and you then make a stroke with a 3-wood, and you then say, oh, I'm going to declare my driver out of play, you have not complied with this rule. You have not done it immediately. What's the consequences of not immediately taking it out of play? You're done. So it is a severe penalty that imposes on the player the requirement that they take the club out of play immediately. Again, there's no interpretation, but I would say it's got to be real soon. Parent 2, before round. If a player becomes aware shortly before starting a round that he or she accidentally, emphasize the word accidentally, has more than 14 clubs, the player should try to leave the excess club or clubs behind. But as an option without penalty, the player may take any such excess club out of play, and the excess club may be kept by the player but not be used, and they do not count in the 14 club rule. If the player deliberately brings more than 14 clubs, this exception does not apply. This is a very narrow exception, and it basically covers one situation. You're at the driving range, you're practicing with 2 different drivers. At the last minute, you realize you got to go to the tee. You forget that you got 15 clubs. You get there, and then you discover that you have the extra driver. Under the old rules, you had to throw it in the bush like Ian Woosen. Now you can declare it out of play, set it on the, you can keep it in your bag as long as you declare it out of play, or you can just put it in the cart and you can play it. But notice that it says it must be done accidentally. I'm not quite sure what that means. I mean, I think that means if they ask you, do you have 15 clubs when you're on the driving range and you say yes, I don't know how it then becomes accidental shortly thereafter, but there it is. And notice it also says shortly before the round starts. I don't know quite what the word shortly means, but it's a narrow exception. All right, let's talk about balls. 4.2a, balls allowed in playing round. Notice the similarity between 4.1a and 4.2a. 4.1a is clubs allowed in making a stroke. This is balls allowed in play of a round. And again, the first parent 1 says conforming ball must be played. In making each stroke, a player must use a ball that conforms to the requirement of the equipment rule. So again, 4.2 only applies to balls that are used in a stroke that counts in the score. You can carry any non-conforming ball you want. In addition, you can actually use a non-conforming ball to make a stroke, provided that ball does not count in the score. An example we gave about hitting a provisional ball would apply here. If you hit it as a provisional ball and it doesn't comply, and it doesn't become the ball in play, no problem. If it does become the ball in play, you're disqualified. John gave the reasons why there was such a severe penalty for disqualification for not using the right conforming club and ball, because there would be no way to figure out what advantage you're getting or not getting from a ball.
Question here.
Yes.
With the one ball condition. Why, Bill and I talked about this last summer, but why does the USGA differentiate between color of ball as being two different balls in the conforming ball, one ball condition? Why is color an issue?
John, let me repeat the question. The question for those online is, under the one ball rule, which I'll talk about in just a minute, why does the USGA apparently differentiate on a color of a ball? So a red ball would be different from a yellow ball. I think that's the question. John Morissette, do you have an answer?
I think that's the question for the USGA's test center. You know, they test each one differently. They test them as separate balls. And why they list them that way, maybe that's just to ensure that in case there is any sort of difference between them, that's accounted for. That's just speculation on my part. But they are tested separately. So for example, if the USGA receives a white version of a ball, it doesn't assume that the yellow and orange versions of that ball are identical to it. You know, it has to test the yellow version, it has to test the orange version, and it just looks at each one as being separate.
So it has nothing to do with like skill or something that, hey, this player, maybe if the ball's yellow, sees it better or whatever. None of that is involved.
No, I think a lot of it, again, my speculation is that they just want to treat each ball the same, regardless of whether they're different by color, different by construction, or whatever, just, so that they aren't making any assumptions.
Total speculation would be that the paint that's used could be different. So the flight characteristics, the white is one type of a paint, the yellow is a different type of paint. So it could affect the flight characteristics. So they're going to test them separately, I would guess.
It is somewhat similar to the new versions of each ball being different listings on the conforming ball list as well.
All right, that's a nice.
Matter if they're both conforming ball, they can change colors.
It depends as to whether the one ball rule is in effect.
The one ball.
Yeah, the one ball was in effect.
Let's finish up sub 1, and then we're going to talk about sub 2 and the local rules that could be applicable. Notice that a player may get a conforming ball to play from anyone else, including another player on the course. So you can borrow a ball, you cannot borrow a club. Parent 2, deliberately altered ball must not be played. Player must not make a stroke at a ball whose performance characteristics have been deliberately altered, such as by scuffing or heating the ball or by applying a substance. Last year, Gary Wild brought up the fact that there was some study somewhere, I don't know anything about it, that suggested that heating a golf ball does not change its performance characteristics. I don't know whether that's true or not. What I can tell you is, as I read the rule, there is no penalty for playing a heated ball. There is only a penalty for playing a ball whose performance characteristics have been changed. If I was the lawyer representing the guy who was disqualified, my argument would be heating does not change the performance characteristics, therefore the performance characteristics were not changed, therefore the person should not be disqualified. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I lose too.
I can say over 40 years of practicing law, I've lost many times. The WSGA has adopted and will continue to adopt, as far as I know, Model Rule G3, which is the listing of conforming golf balls. It is literally a list, and if you go to the USGA website and you look it up, it is staggeringly long. It's just page after page after page, each one with a line entry. So it'll say Titleist, Pro V1, such and such. The next one will be Titleist, Pro V1, such and such. The next one, and on and on and on it goes. Each one of those is a list of the conforming balls. The second rule that the WSGA does not adopt, but many tournaments do, is the so-called one ball rule, and that is Model Local Rule G4. that would require you to use the same ball on the same entry line for the entire round. Again, the WSGA does not adopt that for our tournaments. However, the WSGA serves as the qualifier for many of the USGA events. And as far as I know, they still adopt the one club rule, do they not? I mean, the one ball rule? Yes. So there could be instances in which you are working a USGA qualifier and which the one ball rule needs to be studied, and that's G4. All right. The significance is disqualification if you don't use a conforming ball. All right, let's look at 4.2b. Ball breaks into pieces while playing hole. If a player's ball breaks into pieces after a stroke, there is no penalty and the stroke does not count. This is a very unusual situation. With balls being what they are, this is unlikely to happen. What this says is if you are in the middle of the fairway on a hole, let's say it's you got a 7-iron left, you hit your 7-iron, you hook it a little bit, it hits the cart path, the ball breaks into 2. What are you lying at that moment? 1. How could you be 0? You're lying 1 because you made your drive to the middle of the fairway. That second shot does not count. And notice the words that it uses, the stroke does not count. That means it's just as if you didn't make it. Under the old rules, they use the word cancel. Under the new rules, we use the word does not count. And I think that that is a nice change. The only time you're going to see the word cancel in the new rules is the so-called permissive cancellations in match play. If it is a, quote, mandatory cancellation, the rules will not use the term cancellation. It will use the word does not count. And that signals to you, just as the name implies, it doesn't count. So therefore, you go back to where you were and you play again. Notice that it says the player must play another ball from where that stroke was made, see 14.6. We're going to get to 14.6, but let's have a little preview. You hit your ball from the middle of the fairway. How do you get that ball into play for your second stroke? Do you drop it? Do you place it? Place it? What does 14.6 say? Well, we're going to get to that. But the answer is you've done it, you've hit it from the fairway. You're going to have to, how do you get a ball back in play if you're playing again from the fairway? You're going to drop it in a relief area. You never placed, you're going to drop it in a relief area. Okay, we got a little bit sidetracked there. All right, 4.2c. Ball becomes cut or cracked while playing hole. Notice the term cut or crack. That's the new term. The old one was cut, cracked, or unfit for play. Now it has to be cut or cracked to fall under this rule. Lifting ball to see if it's cut or cracked. If a player reasonably believes that his or her ball has been cut or cracked while playing a hole, the player may lift to look at it, but the spot must be marked and you can't clean it except on the putting green. This is one of the 3 changes where you no longer have to announce to your fellow, you don't call them fellow competitors, you don't call them playing partners, what do you call them? Person you're playing with, or your opponent, you no longer have to announce. You treat it just like any other relief type procedure where you follow the procedures, but you don't have to announce that you're going to use this procedure. And we'll see the next 2 later on. Turn 2 on the next page. When another ball may be substituted. The player may only substitute another ball if it can be clearly seen that the original ball is cut or cracked, and this damage happened during the hole being played. Notice the phrase, it can be clearly seen that the original ball is cut or cracked. There's no requirement that if that ball is cut or cracked, that you preserve it and show it to the committee at the end of the day. The requirement is if it can be clearly cut or cracked. Sorry, it can be clearly seen that it's cut or cracked. So if you got an opponent, he says, yeah, I agree, that's cut. That's the end of it. You get to substitute. If the player says it doesn't, then you're most likely going to want to preserve that ball if you do in fact take relief, and then the committee is going to decide who's right as to whether that ball is cut or cracked. And notice the red language there on the penalty. And this is a continual reference throughout the rules. Anytime you substitute a ball or play from the wrong place, you're going to get the 2-stroke penalty.
So under that subsection, if you drop down to the bullet point, after the main one, it says if the original ball is cut or cracked, the player must replace either another ball on the original spot.
Yes.
But you're saying you drop it.
No, you do. You replace. Yeah.
Got it.
And we're going to see when we get to Rule 14, that's an excellent point, that anytime you pick up a ball because you have marked it, you're always going to replace it. Anytime you pick up a ball to take relief, you're going to be allowed to substitute balls, and you're going to be dropping some exceptions of putting green, but we'll get to those.
I think her point was when the ball breaks into pieces, that stroke doesn't count and you're required to play from where the previous stroke was made. That's when you drop the ball.
And the reason you're not replacing is because you're not putting the ball back in the spot. The ball is now 2 balls. Or
Because
multi-balls.
the original is broken into pieces,
Yeah.
right?
Thank you.
No,
You have to what?
no,
I have to announce.
no. We'll talk more about, that's going to be under Rule 14 and 16, but the answer is you can substitute a ball when the rules permit you to substitute, and there's not a requirement that you tell somebody else. It's good policy to do so, but you are not required to do it. All right, let's look at 4.3, use of equipment. And again, I emphasize this is the theme on Rule 4. It doesn't say equipment that you must or must not carry throughout the round. It says use of equipment. Rule 4.3 applies to all types of equipment that the player might use during a round, except that the requirement to play a conforming ball is in club, a different rule. Here's the key. This rule only concerns how the equipment is used. It does not limit the equipment that a player may have on him or her during a round. So you can carry non-conforming clubs. You can carry non-conforming balls. You can have slope measuring devices in your bag. There's no penalty. It's alignment rods, which is a whole other story, which we're going to get to shortly. So let's look at 4.3a, allowed and prohibited uses of equipment. A player may use equipment to help his or her play during a round, except that a player must not create a potential advantage by. And we're going to go through the 2 specific parts, but notice the prohibition here is you must not create a potential advantage. So if you don't create a potential advantage, the next 2 bullet points aren't even going to come into effect, and you're going to be able to use that equipment. So bullet point 1, use equipment other than a club or ball that artificially eliminates or reduces the need for skill or judgment that is essential to the challenge of the game. And then 2, using equipment, including a ball, in an abnormal way in making a stroke. And the second bullet point is only if you're using it to make a stroke, and is with all of Rule 4, it's a stroke that counts in the player's score. When we look at the particular instances, you know, the top of page 43, this rule does not affect the application of any other rules. And then common examples of uses or equipment that are allowed or not allowed during the player's round are And then we're going to go through these 6. Notice that these are not an exhaustive list. These are simply 6 examples that the drafters of the rule have brought to your attention. If it's not on the list, can you use it or not use it? You got to go back to 4.3a and say, does it create a potential advantage by, and then it has to fit under bullet point 1 or bullet point 2. These 6, the drafters have in effect said, if it's not allowed, they have made the determination for you that it creates a potential advantage, and that's why it's not allowed. So let's go through the examples. Number 1, distance and directional information. You can getting information on distance or direction, such as from a distance measuring device or a compass. So this is a change under the old rules. You couldn't do it unless you had a local rule in effect. Now you can always get distance information by using any device that calculates or allows you to see what the distance is. Not allowed. You can't measure elevation changes. So an example of that would be the slope on your Bushnell or whatever device you're using. But notice the rule prohibits the use. It does not prohibit the carrying. So you can carry a distance measuring device that measures slope. What you can't do is use the device to measure slope. So if there's a way to turn that off, you can continue to use that device to measure distance. You just can't measure slope. And there's a couple of interpretations that were from the old rules that you can still use your club to plumb bob. And the reason is because that is traditionally part of the game. But you cannot use a soda bottle by putting it on the green that shows the way the water slants, or you can't use what I would call to be a standard plumb bob, which is a string with a weight at the bottom. That would be an artificial device, and you can't use it. Basically, you can get distance or directional device from anyone that's available. The blue language, the committee may adopt a local rule prohibiting use of distance measuring devices. There are very few tournaments that have that. The professional tour prohibits it. The high-level amateurs and the WSGA does in, I guess, all their championships now, or just their top
They've
4.
actually gone the reverse direction.
Just the others.
It is allowed in every amateur competition, and it is now also going to be allowed in qualifying for the Open Championship, but not in the actual championships themselves.
But the good news for us at the WSGA level is the rule itself allows you to do it. So the only way you can be prohibited from using it is if we adopt a local rule that prohibits its use, which we will not be doing. All right, second point. Information on wind and other weather conditions allowed. You can get any type of weather information, including wind speed, that is available from weather forecasts. So that means you can pull out your iPhone anytime you want, and you can look up weather information. So you can be sitting in your hotel, and it'll say it's 60 degrees, and then you drive to Whistling Straits, and you find out that it's 43 degrees. And if you can pull up your phone, and if it says it's 43, it says it's 43. You can measure temperature. You can actually go there with the thermometer and measure it on the course if you wanted. Same thing with humidity. What you can't do is that you can't measure wind speed at the course. So can you pull up your phone, read the weather report that says the wind is 50 miles an hour today? Yes. What you can't do is you can't go to the course, hold up one of those little devices that blows the wind through there and say, ah, it's 50 miles an hour. Could you go to the course, get your compass, find that you're hitting due north, read the weather report that says the wind's coming directly out of the north, 50 miles an hour? I think the answer is yes. You can use a compass, and you can get weather information. as long as you're within the pace of play. The last thing under number 2 that is interesting and can trap the unwary, you are not allowed to use an artificial object to get wind-related information. So the classic is you pick up the grass and you throw it up. Grass is natural, it's not artificial. What you can't do is you can't carry with you a little powder thing, and then when you want to throw it up, if that powder material is artificial. Similarly, you can't hold a handkerchief out of your pocket for the purposes of telling which way the wind is. Why? Because it's an artificial object. So just something you need to be aware of. You can use grass, which is probably the preferred.
How about a
Cigarette.
or cigar smoke?
Cigar smoke. I think.
Why do you think I smoke on the go?
I think that's an interesting. John Morissette, do you have an interesting? Do you have a thought on that?
I think there's probably a difference between incidentally noticing where the smoke from your cigar is going versus,
Versus intentionally taking.
yeah,
the pot and
versus
blowing
say
it to make sure
intentionally lighting up on the 12 feet of Augusta National for that purpose. I think that's a big difference.
You could argue that tobacco, whether it be a cigar or a cigarette, is a natural object.
But it's been manufactured. It's just like a log on the course that is a log until you put legs on it. Then it's no longer a natural object. It's a.
All I know is if it's 50 miles an hour, Doug and I would go back into the clubhouse and have a cigar and
Right.
play some chess.
Around the corner, out of the wind.
All right. So the one thing we're sure of under the parent 2 is that you can smoke the cigars in the clubhouse unless they have a rule that says you can't smoke the cigars in the clubhouse. All right. Parent 3 is interesting. Information gathered before or during a round. You are allowed to use information that was gathered before the round, or you can record it for use after the round. What you can't do is both record it and use it during the same round. So as an example, if you have a practice round on the course, you could gather information on what clubs you're going to use. If I'm on the 12th hole at Augusta, I used a 9-iron, blah, blah, blah. You can then use that information during the round. The second point to remember is you can gather all sorts of information during the round, but you can't use it during the round. You have to wait until after the round to use it. So you could wear a heart monitoring device that would show your heart rate for 4 hours. And then when you get done with the round, you would see that your pulse was 72, 72, went to 120. And you say, oh yeah, that's when I was putting on the 3rd hole. You can do that after the round, but you can't collect it and use it during the same round. And that's what the not allowed is: processing and interpreting playing information from the round, or using physiological information recorded during the round. And that's, again, that's the heartbeat monitor situation. You can't both monitor and use it. Audio and video allowed. Listen to audio or watching video on matters unrelated to the competition, but in doing so, consideration must be shown to others. And then the not allowed, well, let me back up. There is, well, let me finish this. Not allowed. Listen to music or other audio to eliminate distractions or to affect swing tempo, and to view video showing play of the player or other players during the competition. That helps you in choosing a club. So the first thing I want to do was talk about the blue language at the bottom of that. It says you can adopt a local rule, G8, that the committee may prohibit or restrict the use of video. The WSGA has not adopted that. However, players are allowed to listen to music quietly unless they distract others. If they distract others, then the WSGA policy is Bill or Jeff or whoever tells them they can't do it or they must turn it down. If they refuse to do it, they could be disqualified under Rule 1.2. It's unlikely that the person would simply say, well, I don't care what you say, Bill. I'm not going to turn it down. Bill would then have the authority, or the committee would have the authority to disqualify.
Has there been a problem?
Never. Never. And it's, people listening to music is becoming more and more prevalent, not less and less.
Yes, and that's true. Yeah, but notice the caveat, you cannot use it if it's going to eliminate distractions or help you with the swing. So you couldn't have a music that has a very strong beat, metronome type, and then you say, oh yeah, when it goes here, then I swing, and so forth. The other thing is, there is a significant interpretation that changes this rule for the high-level tournaments that have video on the premises. If you read it literally, it says you could not view video of showing play of the player on the course. What that's getting at is you can't pull out your iPhone, tune into CBS broadcast when you're standing on the 12th hole of Augusta, and then say, oh, well, Jim Nance said that Tiger used a 9-iron and blah, blah, blah. The interpretation, and it's really an exception, that says you can, however, review and watch anything that is broadcast at the course for spectators. So in other words, if you're standing on the 12th tee and there is a large jumbotron or whatever it is showing Tiger and the announcer saying he's using a 7-iron, the player does not have to disregard that and turn his head. You can watch it and so forth. What you can't do is say, gee, whatever he said, pull out your phone and then look at it. 5, gloves and gripping agents. You can use plain gloves, you can use powder, you can wrap a towel around it. The definition of plain gloves, what they're getting at is you can use any standard golf glove you want. What you can't do is you cannot get a glove that has, say, little bars along it that allow you to place your hand, or strips that are pushed up that allow you to place your hand in a certain way on the club. That's you can't do that, but you can use any plain glove. Not allowed. Use a glove that does not meet the requirements. That's basically what I just described. And use equipment that gives an unfair advantage with hand position or gripping position. An example of that would be the Medicus type hand grip that shows you exactly where to put your hands when you're swinging. That would not be a proper, you couldn't use that as a grip.
Dan, can you go back up under the allowed wrapping a towel or handkerchief around the grip?
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yes, that is allowed.
And
And
making
it's,
it stroke.
yes, and it's kind of strange. That has been in the rules forever. And I don't know why someone would wrap a towel around there, but there it is.
If you just couldn't get a grip on it, it was too wet.
Yeah. Although most people would get a rain glove first, or you would get something. It's odd that you would use a towel, but the rule specifically allows it. And I think the reason it does is because it's been historically allowed.
Why am I allowed to use powder to dry a grip? But if I took the thing of powder and squeezed it up into the air, I have now.
That's what the rule says. So
No, it's not because Dan said so. It's because that's what the rule says. Phil has it exactly right. That's what the rule says. You can use powder to dry the grip, but you can't use the powder to throw it in the air to show the wind direction. All right, let's look at 6. This is a interesting, if not an additional, very significant limitation. Allowed. And again, this is the use of the equipment. Using any equipment for general stretching. So let's just stop right there. You can do anything you want to stretch on the golf course. You can use an alignment rod if you want, but you got to be careful how you use it. If you put it behind your neck and you go to stretch, that's fine because it's used for stretching. If you use those, what do you call those things, those hospital tubing kind of things where you see some people stretch, you can do that. You can put clubs, you can do anything you want for stretching. And it says whether it was used for golf such as an alignment rod, or for purposes unrelated to golf, such as rubber tubing. Then let's look at the prohibitions. Using any type of golf training aid, such as an alignment rod or a non-weighted club, non-conforming club, that in any way creates a potential advantage by helping the player in preparing for making a stroke, such as swing, plane, grip, alignment, ball position, and posture. So you take the example of the alignment rod. You pull it out of your bag, you put it behind your neck, you can stretch it. Then you say, well, I want to help with my alignment. So you take the alignment rod, you put it under your armpits, and you simulate a stroke. Now it's not allowed.
Can you do that with a club though?
The prohibition is the use of any type of training or swing aid. It does not say club. So can you put a club under your armpits? The answer is yes. And again, this is the prohibition on the use of equipment. Notice it says you could not use a non-conforming club to make a practice swing in such a way to create a potential advantage. So a couple of examples of that is you could not put a weighted donut over your club and then swing it. Similarly, you could not use a medicus, if that's, if you know what a medicus is, the heavy weighted club, and making a swing with that because it's a non-conforming club.
In the same vein that you can't use an actual plumb bob, a weight at the end of a string, but you can use a club as a plumb bob.
At the so at the end of 4.3a, I just want to call your attention to a interpretation. It has to do with green reading materials. It is significant for a couple of reasons. One is if you pull out the book, the official guide, it's not in there. And the reason it's not in there is because the book went to publication before they got the green reading material. You will find it at 4.3a/1. It is on your app. If you pull up your app, you will find it. And the green reading material basically is a restriction on the use of green reading materials, and it restricts it in two ways. One is the scale cannot be larger than 3/8 of an inch to 5 yards. The second limitation is the book itself, or the piece of paper, cannot be larger than 7 inches by 4 1/4. And then lastly, you can't blow it up to disregard the restrictions. And again, you will find that at 4.3a/1. Let's go through the last one, 4.3b, equipment used for medical reasons. A player is not in breach of 4.3 if he or she uses equipment to help with a medical condition, so long as the player has a medical reason to use the equipment and the committee decides that it does not give the player an unfair advantage over other players. And then you have the tape or similar covering. A player may use adhesive tape or similar covering for medical reasons, such as to prevent injury or help with existing injury, but the tape must not be applied excessively. Good luck deciding what that word means. And it cannot immobilize a joint. So every time Tiger Woods plays, he puts tape around 2 fingers. Doesn't tape the fingers together, he puts tape on. Is he allowed to do that? Why? Does he have to prove that he has a blister that he's covering up? No. He simply has to show that it's done to prevent an injury. A blister, I think, would be an injury. He says, I put it on there to prevent a blister. Can you do that? Yes.
You're on point.
I'm still warming up with that thing. Does that count as part of the round?
Yeah, and since you yourself have not yet started your round,
Okay,
you know, in that, for example, you know, if you had too many clubs, you could still get
yeah,
rid of
and
them.
that same thing if it was a foursome competition. And
No, they're-
no,
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
decided
Yeah,
started.
I think
Decide,
so.
yeah.
Foursome.
Foursome's different, yeah,
I believe we're back online.
We just need a quick timeout. There's a little power flicker that knocked our internet out. So Thomas is trying to get reback booted up. So yeah, if you could just pause for a
Yeah.
second and we'll get back
Okay,
going and pick
while
back
we're
up.
paused, I'm gonna show my ignorance. The green reading materials clause or portion, can you re-explain that?
Sure. First of all, if you want any guidance, open your app, look at 4.3A1. I mean, that's where it is. What it is, it is a rule that limits the ability of players on the type of materials that they can use anytime they are making a putt or anytime they are playing from off the green with the intent for the ball to end up on the green. And the two principal restrictions are, it is the scope or scale. It cannot be bigger than 3/8 of an inch to 5 yards. And secondly, the book itself or the page itself cannot be bigger than 7 inches by 4 1/4. And the reason it's 4 1/4 is because that's half of 8 1/2. I mean, you think
Are you
of-
asking what green materials are?
A bit, I'm trying
It's,
to.
if you
picture
see
what-
everybody on tour now, they'll have a diagram that shows the green with all the small.
So like a book.
It's a book, just like you have your yardage books and everything, but it's a blow up of the green and it shows all the contour.
Okay.
So a player doesn't have to guess if it breaks from right to left. They can look at the book and it'll tell them it breaks right to left. So there's a limit on those to how detailed they can be. The idea being that you still have to have the skill of reading a green instead of just bringing up a diagram and literally being able to calculate it.
It's usually done at courses that are held tour events, whether they be men's or women's, young or old. And it's not something you normally see at a happenstance country club or golf
But if
course.
I go and play a practice round and I've got a diagram, I've written out which way from my practice round.
That's totally
I
fine.
can use that.
Yeah, that's not, your own notes is not Green's reading material. This
Got it.
is a
Okay.
specific book designed to show the grade of a green. And we're back online.
We're back online. The last thing I want to cover under 4.3B is the use of tape, the kinesio tape. You see this a lot on the LPGA tour. I think the reason you don't see it on the men's tour is because the men wear long pants, and so you don't know whether they have it. But a lot of the women players, particularly Michelle Wee, has a lot of that tape. You see it on the arms, you see it on the shoulders, you see it on the legs. That stuff is permissible. It cannot immobilize joints, and it cannot be used excessively. I have no idea what the term excessively means. There is no interpretation on that. But as far as you can tell, with the amount of tape that some of the players use, the word excessive is given a very expansive term. All right, let's talk about the penalty. And this is, I guess, a new theme in the rules. The old penalty structure was basically you make one mistake and down you go. The new disqualified. The new rules tend to have a stepped process, and 4.3B is a good example. It says penalty for first breach from single act or related act, the general penalty. It's only when you have a penalty for the second breach, unrelated to the first, that you are disqualified. So let's give a couple of examples. The first breach from a single act or a related act. So you pull out your distance measuring device with the scope on it, and you shoot it, and you find that it's 140 yards, but the slope says it's really playing you violated the equipment rule, that's your first single act. You do it on the next hole, you're done. That's the second violation. Notice that the acts do not have to be related. You could use a green reading material, a distance measuring device with slope on the first hole and a weighted donut on the second hole, and you're disqualified. The first act, you get it free. The second act, you're done. The way I remember the term single act or related act is as follows. If this helps, you can write it in. If it complicates you, then you don't need to. But I read this to say, penalty for first breach from single act or related act, and I would insert where there is no intervening event. Again, the term where there is no intervening event. So what does that mean? That means if you use the slope feature, you then go back, you put it in your bag, you go to hit it, you're playing the senior tour and you say, I forgot what I did. You go back to get it, you look at it again, there's no intervening event, you're still going to get the single penalty of the first breach, which is the general penalty. So what
Tell
are
me
the...
I haven't done that.
All right. The intervening events that you need to know about, and there's an interpretation on that, and it's 1.3C4, and it talks about intervening events. Intervening events are three things: making a stroke, putting a ball in play, and becoming aware of the breach. Those are the three intervening events. So if you use your slope, you put it back in your bag, you forget what it is, you use it, you're still on your first breach, you go back a third time because you're on the super seniors, not just the seniors, you're still okay. You have not gone into the second category. However, if you use your slope, then you put it back in your bag, you drop the ball off the cart path, you've now put a ball in play. When you use that the next time, you're down the road, you're disqualified. And again, those are the three intervening events. You got to know those. Make a stroke, put a ball in play, and become aware of the breach. The last part of this, it says penalty for second breach unrelated to the first breach. The way I remember this is I then insert the words, or at least keep in my mind, they're unrelated to the first breach, either because they are in fact unrelated acts, or because they are related acts separated by an intervening event. So if you have an intervening event, you're into the second one, you're disqualified. If the acts themselves are unrelated, you're disqualified.
Putting a ball in play, becoming aware of the breach. What was it?
Making a stroke. And that's very nicely laid out in interpretation 1.3C, parent 4/1. Any questions on Rule 4? All right, I believe now we have our chairman of the, what's your title? Director, sorry. Director of Rules and Competitions for the WSGA.
Guy brings the pastries.
And eats them.
No, that's Thomas.
Okay, so I know all of you in the room have a paper copy of these questions, and I'm hoping Thomas is able to show these questions online, and it looks like he's getting to that process. You know, one of the things that we've talked about is all of you in this room want to get the highest score possible on a test, if that's what melts your butter. But generally, that's the benchmark for your rules knowledge. I mean, there's no other way to test how well you know the rules other than on a test. And our hope is this year to not only teach you the rules, but also to how to get you to think when you're taking these tests put out by the USGA, or if it's our exam, although we hope you don't get to the point where you need to take our exam, because that would mean you didn't succeed at the 100-question test, then you didn't succeed on the 80-question test. So the backstop would be our 50-question test, which we have yet to have someone need to get to, and that's thanks to John and Dan and their great teaching. And I think all of you that have taken part in these review sessions in the past, and Phil, you'd attest to this, everyone's score has gone up since John and Dan have agreed to teach these classes. And who, you know, it's like seeing your golf scores go down because of a golf professional teaching you. Well, it's seeing your rule scores go up because professionals are teaching you. The questions that we have were sent to us by the USGA, and they're not to be shared, although they're going to be shared online. But we have been selected along with Indiana to kind of use these questions to help people prepare, in hopes that more people are better educated in taking the exam, which, if you've not taken it, is a humbling experience the first time, and it gets better, like life, with each and every time you take it thereafter. If you've attended a USGA PGA workshop, you know that at the end of each rule, they will pop up one question. Sometimes it's very easy, sometimes it's not. We have selected 2 questions, or 3 in some cases, questions for each rule that pertain to that particular rule. And we're just going to go in order today. I think we have plenty of time. But question number 1, in stroke play, a player's ball lies in a bunker. Before playing the ball, he or she makes several practice swings, each time touching sand in the bunker. Player also breaks an attached branch with his or her hand, improving the area of his or her backswing. What is the ruling? So first of all, do we have a breach, multiple breaches? If it's multiple breaches, are they related? Are they unrelated? Those are the things that we need to figure out. So let's break it down. So the player took several practice swings in a bunker. Is each one of those times during the practice swings that the club head touches the sand, is that a penalty? And the answer is no, unless someone after the first one said, hey, you can't do that. But the question doesn't say that. It just says they took several. So you have multiple breaches of a single act. So that is a breach of Rule 12.1b, the bunker rule, that prohibits you from touching sand in a bunker before playing the ball. So that's a penalty of 2 strokes. Now the player also broke an attached branch, improving the area of your backswing. So I've certainly improved one of my 5 conditions that affect my stroke. And that is also a breach. And that breach is not related to taking the practice swings in the bunker. So I have a 2-stroke penalty for a breach of Rule 8.1. A, which is improving the conditions affecting my stroke. I also have 2 penalty strokes for touching the sand in the bunker. So the correct answer should be the total penalty of 4 strokes. Does everyone hopefully see that? Perfect. We'll move on to question number 2. If Thomas can slide that up for the people online. Question number 2 also pertains to Rule 1. In stroke play, a player takes lateral relief from a red penalty area. The player properly drops a ball, but it rolls and comes to rest more than 2 club lengths from the reference point. The player plays the ball. So what is the penalty? Well, we know there's a 1-stroke penalty for proceeding under the water hazard rule. We also know that the player, when he played his ball, he played it from a place more than 2 club lengths from where the reference point, which is the point where the ball last crossed the edge of the red penalty area. So he played from a wrong place under Rule 17. So that's an additional 2-stroke penalty. Now the question is, do you cancel one of those penalties out? And more likely, if you were going to cancel it, it would be the 1-stroke. But as we learned under Rule 1.4b, the very last paragraph says, but any penalty stroke the player gets for taking penalty relief, such as 1-stroke penalty under Rule 17.1, 18.1, and 19.2, are always applied in addition to any other penalties. So we know we get a 1-stroke penalty for Rule 17. We get a 2-stroke penalty for playing from a wrong place under Rule 17, which is really 14.7. And the answer is C. There is a total penalty of 3 strokes. Does everyone follow along with that?
In addition to 17 and 16, where the relief scenario that is also applied no matter what. Which
Correct.
one is that?
If I were to proceed under the 1-stroke penalty of dropping back on the line outside the bunker and taking relief from either, well, it would be a abnormal course condition. There weren't many questions under Rule 2, but hopefully these will drive home the point of the different areas of the course under Rule 2. Question number 3 is, the teeing area of the hole being played is designated as the general area. And we kind of went over this, John did, when covering this rule, but the teeing area of the hole being played is its own separate part of the course. And if it's its own separate, I think they call it specific area of the course, it can't be part of the general area. So the answer is false. If there's one thing as a rules person you need to understand, it's what area of the course applies. That is fundamental. In the old rule book, they had how to use the rules book, and one of them was where on the course am I, and you need to understand that. Question number 4 also pertains to Rule 2. Which of the following is correct regarding a ball lying in 2 parts of the course? Well, with regard to this question and this rule, you really only need to know a few things. 1, if your ball lies in the general area and one of the other 4 specific areas of the course, it's deemed to lie in the specific area of the course. If it touches 2 specific parts of the course at one time, you have to understand that the order is penalty area, bunkers, and then putting green. Why? Because that goes from the most penalized to the least penalized parts of the course. So, which of the following is correct? Answer A is if part of the ball is in both the penalty area and a bunker, it is treated as lying in the bunker. And you kind of have to think of these as true and false. When you get a question that says, which of the following is correct? Or which of the following is true? I can assure you, you've just been handed 4 separate questions, and you need to answer each of the 4 questions before you ever come up with an answer. So answer all 4 and then decide which one is correct. If you get 2 that are correct and 2 that are incorrect, you're kind of off base there. And,
Halfway home.
but yeah, right. So if a ball is both in a penalty area and a bunker, we talked about the order being penalty area, bunker, putting green, it would deem to be lying in the penalty area. So that statement is not correct. Answer B, if part of the ball is in both the general area and one of the specific areas of the course, it is treated as line in that specific area of the course. That's a true statement. So I would write true or correct in this case after that. We'll go on to question C. If part of the ball is both in a bunker and the putting green, it is treated as laying on the putting green. Well, we know the order is penalty area, bunker, putting green. So we know that that's not correct or true because it would be deemed to be lying in the bunker if it touched both of those. And D, in starting play of a hole, a small part of the player's ball is slightly ahead of the line between the forwardmost point of the two tee markers. However, part of the ball is still inside the teeing area. The player's ball is considered to be in the general area because part of the ball touches the general area. We're going to see when we get to Rule 6 that if my ball touches any part of the teeing area, I am deemed to be in the teeing area, not the general area. So because of that, my ball is in the teeing area. It's not to be considered in the general area. So that answer is not correct. So the correct answer for question 4 should be B. And that is if I'm touching both the general area and one of the specific areas, I'm deemed to be in the specific area of the course. Any questions on that? We'll move along to question 5. In stroke play, a player chips his third shot up a steep hill. The ball doesn't make it to the top of the hill and then begins to roll back to him. Saw that a few times last night on the Tournament of Champions. As is rolling back, he moves a divot he had created out of the way so that the ball doesn't hit it. Sounds a little bit like Camilo Villegas. He chips on and then takes 2 putts to complete the hole. He is unaware that moving the loose impediment is not permitted and returns his scorecard with a score of 6 for the hole. The committee becomes aware of his actions before the completion of the competition. This could be even after he's returned his scorecard, obviously. Could be a different day. What is the ruling? Well, if the player hit his third shot up the steep hill and subsequently moved a divot while it was rolling back, and then he subsequently hit his 4th shot, he chips on, would be his 4th shot, and then took 2 putts to complete the hole, he would have 6 without any further penalty strokes. So we know for sure his score is probably not going to be 6. The question is moving a divot, a loose impediment, a penalty or not? And it would not be a penalty if the ball was not in motion. But because the ball is in motion and could influence the ball, that is not allowed under either 11.3 or exception 2 to Rule 15.1a. And that exception steers you right back to Rule 11.3. We know that he's going to get the penalty. What's the penalty? 2 strokes. Okay, well, unlike before under Lexi Thompson, we're going to give her the additional penalty of 2 strokes for the breach of moving the divot, but not any scorecard penalty that was the case in 16 and 17. So the correct answer is the committee should adjust the player's score and add the 2-stroke penalty for a violation of Rule 15.1a to his score for a total of 8. If this had been prior to during 16 and 17, the player's score would have been 10, but we're not going to add that.
So what were they trying to throw us off with Rule 3.3 being green?
That is, you've returned a score lower than you actually made, but you were unaware of the penalty. And it says that right in he is unaware that moving a loose impediment is not permitted. It probably should say he is unaware that moving the loose impediment while his ball is in motion is not permitted. But that's kind of implied with the way the question reads before that. You know, the other answer is, as I mentioned, the old way in 16 and 17, the answer might have been C, and prior to 2016, the answer would have been D. So you can see how the rules affect, how they've changed affect what the answers are, which is a good enough reason to keep studying the rules and noting the changes. Any questions on question 5? Move on to question 6. The committee in a handicap stroke play competition issues scorecards with the player's name, date, and handicap printed on them. And I can assure you most associations in the country do just what we do, which is that. The handicap on a player's scorecard was incorrect. It showed a 10 instead of a 7. So a handicap that listed was too high than the 7 it should have been. Following the first round of competition, the player signed and returned his card to the committee without correcting the handicap error, resulting in an incorrect net score. We would never see that from a net player, would we? The committee discovers the error prior to the second round of the competition. So certainly after the player's returned his card. What is the ruling? Well, is the answer A, there's no penalty and the incorrect handicap stands? No. If the player was unaware that his handicap was 7, there is no penalty and the handicap must be corrected by the committee. No, the rule itself says the player is responsible. C, the player gets the general penalty added to his first round score. No. Or the player is disqualified. And the answer comes from Rule 3.3b, parent 4, or interpretation 3.3b4/2. In either case, whether they're printed on the card or not, the player is responsible to ensure that his handicap is listed correctly. And I can assure you that in each and every WSGA competition, one of us, myself, Jeff, or Thomas, instructs everyone to make sure that the handicap listed on your card is correct. Why is that important? Because the handicap that's listed on your card is also the one that's calculating it in the computer, which is where that's generated from. And if we don't have that correct number and it's too high, the penalty is disqualification. What if it were too low of a handicap? You play with the low handicap. So the correct answer is obviously D. The player would be disqualified even in the case where the committee puts the handicap on the scorecard. Question 7 regarding Rule 4. In stroke play, in 4-ball stroke play, in groups of 4 with side AB playing with side CD, after player A plays from the second teen area, but before any other player plays, his partner, player B, discovers that he or she has mistakenly carried 15 clubs from the start due to a club that he or she failed to remove at the range before the round. What is the ruling? Well, we know that player B has too many clubs, so he is for sure getting a penalty. And if they started on 1, he gets the penalty on 1. His partner has already played from the second hole, so the play has begun of the second hole. So player B is for sure going to get 4 penalty strokes. If we go to Rule 23.8a, we're going to see for that particular rule, if a partner breaches the 14 club rule, the player, I mean, his partner also gets the penalty. Why? Because if the partner's score counted on the hole and he didn't get the penalty, it's the same as the side not getting the penalty at all. And the rules want to ensure that in some way, shape, or form, the penalty is applied. So the correct answer is C. There is a total penalty of 4 strokes to both partners, player A and player B. Any questions on that particular thing? I think that
Like you're one.
with that particular rule, if you go to Rule 23.8 in the rule book, it'll list all the different penalties, but it in particular 23.8 parent 2, 3 situations where player's penalty also applies to partner. And the first bullet point is when player breaches 4.1b, limit of 14 clubs, shared, added, or replaced clubs. In match play, the side gets the penalty. In stroke play, the partner also gets the same penalty as the player. So that.
Bill, would you say that this question would be more likely to show up in the closed book or the open book section?
Boy, from my experience, I would say the closed book. Wouldn't you?
No, I think
Do you think it would be open book?
it'd be the open book, because that gets you just totally scrambled looking for the answer if you don't know that. I've determined that most of the open book questions
Involved too, are the
involve multiple issues. And when you start, if you don't know the book, you're going to be all over the map.
Right.
The thing I would point out about this is, one is, this will be on a national exam.
Oh, yeah.
Words may change, but this concept is going to be on. The second thing is, it's the 14 club rule. The red flag should go off. This is the oddball. It's an adjustment penalty. You apply it if it's between holes, apply it to the last one. And as Bill points out, it's Rule 23.8, and both partners are going to get the penalty.
Yeah, and under Rule 23, there's, that Rule 23.8a is a great section. It says penalty normally applies only to player, not partner. Then the next section, 3 situations where the partner gets the penalty. And the next section after that talks about the disqualification penalties and when that applies to one of the players or the side and which rules they have to breach for either one of those situations. And that would certainly be an open book scenario.
But I do get why this penalty should apply to both partners for when it hurts the opponent or helps you. But why is the 14 club rule, when one guy does it, why do they feel that's important that the side gets hurt?
Okay, you have to think of it. If you and I are partners and I'm carrying 15 clubs and the penalty only applied to me, and we went and played the hole, and your score counted on hole 1 and on hole 2, effectively, is there any penalty that's been handed out? None whatsoever. If your score counts and I'm the only one penalized, effectively for our side, there's been no penalty. Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but also, especially in match play, when there's an adjustment to a match, you can't do that with just one partner. Yeah, you can only do that for the side.
Question 8, should we repeat that just in case? Hopefully that was picked up. Question 8, also on Rule 4, on the 5th tee of a stroke play competition, player A inadvertently pulls out player B's driver out of player B's bag and, most importantly, makes a stroke with that driver from the teeing area. He then realizes his mistake, hands that club to player B, and declares it out of play. Player A then makes a stroke with his own driver from within the 15 area. He abandons the first ball, the one that was played with player B's driver, and takes 4 more strokes at the second ball for 5 total to complete play of the hole. He continues the round and then plays from the next tee or the sixth tee. What is player A's score for the fifth hole? So first of all, he used a club that wasn't his own. What's that penalty? 2 strokes. The ball, yeah, the ball that he hit off of the tee with a club that was not his own, is that ball in play or not? It's in play. Okay, well, what did this player do? He abandoned it and he played another ball from the teeing area, this time with his own driver. Well, the rules don't care what club you hit, just that you put another ball into play. Well, what stroke was that? 1 or was it 3? 3. He then took 4 more strokes at the second ball. So he made 7, correct? But he also gets a 2-stroke penalty for using player B's driver, which is a total of 9. You all kind of follow that, hopefully? He should have. Should have. That ball was correct. You know, if a player ever finds in this, let's say I was playing with Doug and we're sharing a cart and I pull his driver out and I hit it. If I'm not sure at that point what to do, declare that you're going to play a second ball, and with which ball you want to score with. Well, probably want to score with maybe the second because I feel that's the one that's in play. Well, the rules are going to preclude that. So you can guard yourself as a player of being uncertain. That's what always disturbs me a little bit when players don't take that option of playing the second ball, you know, and usually as officials, you're usually told about this for the player's sake, hopefully before he tees off on 6. And if not, hopefully in a fashion where he won't get disqualified.
Let me say one thing. Anytime you have a question that asks, what is the total score? I always make 2 columns. In the first one, I write down talent strokes actually made. The second column, put down penalty strokes.
Right.
When you add this up, you come to the conclusion that the player hit the ball 6 times. So he's going to get at least a 6. Then he's got 1 penalty for stroke and distance, that's 7. And then he's got 2 penalty strokes for
Using the club that was not
14 club.
And the 14 club rule does not go back to the 4 holes previous because it was not in his bag.
Yeah, he did not use he was not carrying or using that club other than that particular instance, which was only the 5th hole. And if that were the case, the answer would have had to have been 11, and that's not one of the options. So you know that would not be the case. So hopefully everyone's pretty square on that. Thomas, we'll move to number 9, the last question of the day, also on Rule 4. After teeing off on the first hole of a stroke play competition with his 3-wood, a player realizes that he forgot to adjust the weights on his driver to his preferred setting. Before teeing off on the second hole, he adjusts the weight of the driver. Before he tees off, his actions are questioned. What is the ruling? Well, the answer A, since he had not made a stroke with the driver, he was entitled to adjust the weight with no penalty before using it. Answer B, since he did not make a stroke with the driver after adjusting the weight, he may change the driver back to its configuration at the start of the round with no penalty and may continue to use it after that. C, he is penalized 2 strokes to be added to his score for the second hole, and he must declare the driver out of play or be disqualified. In answer D, the player is disqualified for changing the playing characteristics of a club selected for play. So Any guesses on the answer? The answer is B, because he had not yet made a stroke with his driver. He had simply carried it. He is allowed to reconfigure the club, the adjustable club, to its original setting, and provided he had not made a stroke that counted in his score, that would be the answer B. So any other questions on that? Next week, we'll be covering rules 5, 6, 7, and 8, and we'll have more questions for you at the end. If there's anything that you feel that we can add, whether those of you in this room or those of you online, the idea is to help all of you, better learn the rules, or best learn the rules as possible. And we hope you find these sessions entertaining, enjoyable, and informative. So we want to thank you all for coming today. Our next session will be next Friday, January 10th, also starting at 8 o'clock and likely going until 12 or right around there. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you next week. YouTube. And it'll be, if you simply go to YouTube and into the search thing, type in WSGA rules. I did it yesterday and all the 19 sessions came up. Yeah, we should have it up by later today or tomorrow. Well, I assure you it won't be tomorrow. So forgot today's Friday. If it's not up today, it'll be up on Monday for sure. So thank you all very much. Next Friday, January 10th.
All right, thanks, sir. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, John. Thanks. You won't be in Hawaii next Friday, John?